The snowflakes fell like silent confessions in the darkness, each one carrying a secret to the frozen ground below. Grace Sullivan stumbled forward, her breath forming desperate clouds in the bitter Wyoming cold. Blood trickled from her forehead, staining the pristine white snow crimson. In her arms, she clutched a bundle wrapped in wool blankets, pressing it tightly against her chest as if it were her own beating heart. "Shh, Oliver," she whispered, though the baby had long since fallen silent. "We're going to be all right." Behind her, footsteps crunched through the snow, gaining ground. A dark figure moved between the skeletal trees, pursuing her with steady determination. Grace cast a desperate glance over her shoulder, then looked ahead at the distant farmhouse, its single window glowing with warm, golden light. So close, yet impossibly far in the deepening snowdrift. The wind howled a warning through the pines. Grace adjusted her grip on the child and pushed forward, each step a battle against the elements in the shadow at her back. Not all love begins with a first glance. Sometimes it begins with a hard truth spoken aloud. And for Grace Sullivan, it began 4 months earlier, on a crisp autumn afternoon in Carter's Hollow, Wyoming Territory, 1889. The stagecoach rattled to a halt in a cloud of dust, its wooden wheels creaking in protest. Grace Sullivan sat motionless for a moment, gathering her courage before stepping down. The journey had been long, 3 days from Cheyenne, but the distance from her past felt immeasurable. "Carter's Hollow, end of the line," announced the driver, a weathered man with eyes that had seen too many miles and too few smiles. Grace adjusted her worn brown dress, smoothed her apron, and tucked a wayward strand of chestnut hair beneath her handkerchief. Her cheeks burned red from both the biting wind and the familiar discomfort of being scrutinized. At 28, she had endured enough stares to recognize their weight. She was a large woman, not tall but substantial in frame, with hands made strong by years of kneading dough and stirring pots. Her face, round and plain by society's measure, carried a quiet dignity that few bothered to notice. Her green eyes, however, held an intelligence and kindness that transcended conventional beauty. "Thornfield Ranch is down that road," the driver said, pointing to a dirt path that wound through the golden prairie. "Though I doubt anyone's waiting for you." He tossed her carpet bag onto the ground with little ceremony, climbed back onto his perch, and with a flick of his whip, the stagecoach continued its journey, leaving Grace alone in a swirl of dust and silence. She stood for a moment, taking in her surroundings. Carter's Hollow was barely a town, a collection of wooden buildings lining a single main street, a church spire rising in the distance, and scattered homesteads dotting the vast landscape. The mountains loomed blue and ancient on the horizon, indifferent to her arrival. Grace picked up her carpetbag and started down the path toward Thornfield Ranch. The late autumn sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass, which whispered secrets in the wind. Each step carried her away from one life and toward another, though whether it would be better or worse remained to be seen. After 20 minutes of walking, she spotted the ranch house, a 2-story wooden structure with a wide porch and a stone chimney. A barn stood nearby, along with several outbuildings. No smoke rose from the chimney, and no one came out to greet her. The only signs of life were chickens scratching in the yard and a horse watching curiously from the corral. But as Grace drew closer, she heard it, a sound that pulled at something deep and old inside her. A baby crying. The wail was desperate, thin, and seemingly endless, pouring from the partially open front door like a plea. Without hesitation, Grace climbed the porch steps and pushed the door open. The crying grew louder, guiding her through the silent house. The kitchen was her first stop, a spacious room with a cast iron stove gone cold, unwashed dishes piled high in the sink, and a wooden table strewn with papers and empty bottles. A baby's bottle lay on its side, milk dried around the rim. The air smelled stale, as if the windows hadn't been opened in days. Grace followed the crying down a narrow hallway to a small bedroom. There, in a wooden crib that had seen better days, lay a baby with a face flushed red from exertion. He couldn't have been more than 4 months old, his tiny fists balled in frustration, his body damp with sweat. "Oh, little one," Grace murmured, setting down her bag. She approached slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. With practiced ease, she reached into the crib and lifted the child, cradling him against her shoulder. He was too warm, a slight fever, she guessed, and his diaper needed changing. "There now," she whispered, swaying gently from side to side. "You're all right." The baby's cries stuttered and then hiccuped into whimpers. Grace hummed softly, an old Irish lullaby her grandmother had taught her, the Gaelic words flowing from memory. Seo ithin, seo ho, mo store, mo liamb, mo shoid gun chulg, mo chuid gun soil mhor. As she sang, she felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. But she didn't turn around, just continued her gentle rocking and humming. "Your mama's gone, isn't she?" she whispered to the child. "I know what that feels like. She died in childbirth." The voice, deep and hollow, came from the doorway. Grace turned slowly, the baby now quiet against her shoulder. A tall man stood there, his frame filling the space. He wore a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle. His face was half hidden behind several weeks' worth of beard, but she could see that he might once have been handsome, before grief had carved its lines around his eyes and mouth. Those eyes, a startling blue, like a winter ski, regarded her with a mixture of suspicion and desperate relief. On his shirt hung a tarnished badge, a caduceus, the symbol of medicine, pinned to the fabric as if it were both a reminder and an accusation. "You're the new cook," he said. Not a question, but a statement. Grace straightened her spine, adjusting the baby in her arms. "Grace Sullivan," she replied. "Most call me Grace." The man's eyes moved from her face to the child, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder. Something shifted in his expression, a brief softening, quickly masked. Grace felt the familiar weight of judgment as his gaze traveled over her figure, taking in her sturdy build, her plain features. She had endured this assessment countless times, in countless kitchens. But unlike those other times, she didn't lower her eyes or fidget with her apron. Instead, she spoke plainly, her voice soft but unwavering. "No one wants to hire a fat girl, Mr. Thornfield. But I can nurse the baby." Her words hung in the air between them, not an apology or a plea, but a simple truth. She had learned that honesty, however brutal, was cleaner than false niceties. The man, Thornfield, looked at her for a long moment. He didn't smile, but something in his rigid posture seemed to give way, like ice beginning to crack under spring sun. "Then stay," he said. He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Grace stood motionless, the sleeping child warm against her neck, her heart pounding with an emotion she couldn't name, not quite relief, not quite fear, but something in between. She looked down at the baby boy in her arms. "Well," she whispered, "I suppose we'd better get you cleaned up, little one." Ethan Thornfield hadn't always been a man of few words and fewer smiles. Once he had been a young doctor with steady hands and bright prospects, graduating from medical school in Philadelphia before the war tore the country apart. When the fighting began, he volunteered as an army surgeon, believing his skills could make a difference in the bloody chaos. The memory came to him unbidden as he retreated to his study. A flash of a field hospital in Virginia, the endless parade of broken bodies, the screams of men begging for mercy or death. His hands, once confident, had begun to tremble after 2 years of sawing through limbs and digging bullets from flesh. The faces of those he couldn't save haunted his sleep, accusatory ghosts with hollow eyes. He poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and downed it in one swallow, welcoming the familiar burn. The liquor didn't silence the memories, but it blurred their edges enough to function. When he returned from the war, he was not the same man who had left. The Thornfield name still carried weight in Boston society, but Ethan could no longer bear the weight of a scalpel. His father, the esteemed Dr. William Thornfield, had arranged his marriage to Victoria Blackwood, daughter of a wealthy banking family, beautiful and refined, hoping it would settle him down. Victoria had wanted a husband with status. Ethan had wanted, well, he wasn't sure what he'd wanted anymore. Peace, perhaps, a purpose that didn't involve blood and death. They had moved west after the wedding, away from the suffocating expectations of Boston society, to the Wyoming territory where his mother's family owned land. And now Victoria was gone, leaving behind a son who needed more than Ethan knew how to give. He stared at the stack of medical books on his desk, their leather spines cracked from years of use. He hadn't opened them since Victoria's death. What was the point? His knowledge hadn't saved her. His training had failed when it mattered most. From the kitchen came the sounds of movement. The new cook, Grace Sullivan, already at work. He had barely glanced at the letter from the employment agency recommending her. All he knew was that she had experience in several well-to-do homes and came with references describing her as capable and discreet. Capable she certainly seemed to be. The baby, Oliver, had stopped crying for the first time in what felt like days. And discreet? While there was something refreshing about her blunt honesty, no one wants to hire a fat girl. As if her size was simply a fact, neither a source of shame or a request for pity. Ethan pulled a piece of paper toward him and wrote a brief note. Feed baby at 8, 12, and 4. Check supplies in root cellar. I take dinner in my study at 6. He would leave it on the kitchen table. It was easier this way. No need for conversation. No need to see the pity or curiosity in another person's eyes. Everyone in Carter's Hollow already whispered about the widower doctor who couldn't save his own wife. He didn't need to see those whispers reflected in his cook's gaze. Ethan leaned back in his chair, suddenly exhausted. Through the window, he watched as the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Another day ending, another night to endure. And yet, for the first time in months, the house was quiet. No crying, just the distant sound of a woman's voice, humming a melody he didn't recognize. Grace settled into a routine with the efficiency of someone accustomed to adapting quickly. The kitchen became her domain, scrubbed clean and organized to her liking. She rose before dawn each day, stoked the fire in the stove, and prepared breakfast. Hearty oatmeal with dried apples and cinnamon, fresh eggs from the chickens, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Little Oliver thrived under her care. She bathed him daily, sewed new clothes from fabric she found in a trunk, and fed him milk with herbs added to ease his digestion. His fever disappeared and his cries became less frequent, replaced by coos and the occasional delighted gurgle. Ethan Thornfield remained a shadow, appearing briefly at meal times or passing through rooms like a ghost. He left notes on the kitchen table each morning, brief instructions or requests, but rarely spoke directly to Grace. She replied in kind, leaving notes of her own. Oliver slept through the night, or preserves running low, need to order more. The ranch hands, 4 men who tended the cattle and repaired the buildings, watched her curiously from a distance. They ate at a separate table in the kitchen, wolfing down the hearty meals she prepared with murmured thanks. One week after her arrival, Grace was hanging laundry in the yard when she overheard 2 of the men talking by the barn. Thornfield hired himself a nursemaid, not just a cook, said one, a lanky man with a weather-beaten face. More like 2 women in one, replied the other with a snicker. She's big enough to count double. Think the boss has taken a shine to her? Wouldn't be the first widower to seek comfort in the kitchen. Nah, he barely looks at her, or at anything these days. Can't blame him. After what happened with the missus, Grace kept her head down, pinning a sheet to the line with more force than necessary. The gossip wasn't new. She'd heard worse in other households. But something about their speculation regarding Ethan bothered her. The man was clearly suffering, not looking for comfort from anyone. That's enough, came a new voice, deep and authoritative. Grace glanced up to see a tall, broad-shouldered man approaching the gossips. Unlike the other ranch hands, he wore a vest over his shirt and carried himself with quiet dignity. His hair and beard were shot through with gray, though he couldn't have been much over 40. Back to work, he ordered. Those fence posts won't set themselves. The men shuffled off, properly chastised. The newcomer turned toward Grace, tipping his hat in greeting. Crawford, he introduced himself. Ranch foreman, you must be Miss Sullivan. Grace, she replied, nodding. Thank you for that. Crawford shrugged. Men get bored, talk nonsense. Pay them no mind. He paused, studying her with kind brown eyes. How's the little one doing? Better, still congested when the air turns cold, but eating well. Crawford nodded, satisfied. Good. This place needed, well, it needed what you're bringing to it, Miss Sullivan. Life, I suppose. Before Grace could respond, the sound of hooves drew their attention. A sleek black carriage with polished brass fittings was approaching, pulled by 2 matching bay horses. It looked startlingly out of place against the rugged backdrop of the ranch, a piece of Boston elegance transplanted to Wyoming soil. "Trouble," muttered Crawford. "Miss Blackwood's back." The carriage came to a stop and a liveried driver jumped down to open the door. A woman emerged, tall, slender, dressed in an expensive traveling suit of deep burgundy. Her dark hair was pinned in an elaborate style beneath a hat adorned with a small stuffed bird. Even at a distance, Grace could see that she was beautiful in a cold, austere way. Eleanor Blackwood surveyed the ranch with evident distaste before her gaze fell on Grace. Her expression sharpened with interest. "You there," she called. "Are you the new help?" Grace wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward. "Grace Sullivan, I cook and care for the child." Eleanor approached, looking Grace up and down with undisguised assessment. "I see, and where's my nephew? Inside, I presume?" "He's napping, ma'am." "I'm not, ma'am. I'm Miss Blackwood. Victoria Thornfield was my sister." Her voice softened slightly at the mention of the name. "I've come to check on Oliver's welfare." Just then, the front door opened, and Ethan stepped onto the porch. He had shaved, Grace noticed, and wore a clean shirt, though it hung loosely on his frame. He looked like a man bracing himself for a storm. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "we weren't expecting you." "Clearly," she replied, gesturing to the laundry on the line. "I see domestic matters have taken a substantial turn since my last visit." The emphasis on substantial was slight but unmistakable. Grace felt her cheeks burn, but kept her expression placid. Eleanor ascended the porch steps, removing her gloves with deliberate precision. "I trust you have received my letters regarding Oliver's future education and upbringing." "I have," Ethan replied, "and as I wrote back, he's not yet 5 months old." "Harvard can wait." A brittle smile played at Eleanor's lips. "Humor. How refreshing. Coming from you, Ethan. We'll talk inside." She swept past him into the house without a backward glance. Ethan's eyes briefly met Grace's, a flicker of something like apology in their blue depths, before he followed his sister-in-law. Crawford sighed beside Grace. "Miss Blackwood visits every few months. Stays a week, rearranges everything, makes everyone miserable, then leaves. Best to lay low while she's here." Grace nodded, returning to her laundry. But her mind was racing, piecing together the dynamics at play. The elegant sister from Boston, the grieving widower, the baby caught between worlds, and now herself an unexpected addition to this fragile balance. "Miss Sullivan," Crawford added quietly, "Miss Blackwood believes her sister should never have left Boston society for this wilderness, as she calls it. She blames Ethan for Victoria's death, though she's too proper to say it outright." "Why tell me this?" Grace asked. Crawford's weathered face creased in a brief smile. "Because you're good with the baby, because the house doesn't feel like a tomb anymore since you arrived, and because everyone deserves fair warning before walking into a snake pit." With that, he tipped his hat and strode toward the barn, leaving Grace to contemplate the coiled tensions hidden beneath the ranch's quiet surface. Night fell early in late autumn, wrapping the ranch in velvety darkness. Grace had put Oliver to bed after his evening feeding and retreated to her own small room off the kitchen. It was simple but clean, a narrow bed with an iron frame, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a hook for her few dresses, and a small window that looked out over the eastern pasture. From the main part of the house, she could hear the murmur of voices. Eleanor and Ethan, still engaged in whatever discussion had begun hours earlier. Occasionally, Eleanor's voice would rise, sharp with indignation, before subsiding again to a controlled murmur. Grace sat on the edge of her bed and unlaced her boots, sighing as she stretched her tired feet. From beneath her pillow, she withdrew a small, embroidered handkerchief, yellowed with age and worn thin from handling. In one corner, a name was stitched in faded blue thread, Clara. Grace traced the letters with her fingertip, a ritual performed so many times that the motion was automatic, meditative. In the privacy of her small room, she allowed her carefully maintained composure to slip, just a little. "I met a baby today, Clara," she whispered. "A little boy. He has your eyes, that same serious look, as if he's trying to understand everything at once." The memory came, unbidden but familiar. Her own child, barely 6 months old, burning with fever in her arms. The tiny chest struggling for breath. The doctor shaking his head. The father, a young banker's son, who had sworn his love before disappearing at the first sign of scandal, Nowhere to be found. I couldn't save you, Grace murmured to the empty room. But maybe I can help him. A knock at her door startled her from her reverie. She quickly tucked the handkerchief away and smoothed her dress. Yes? The door opened slightly, revealing Eleanor Blackwood. The elegant woman had changed into an evening dress of deep blue silk, though she looked no less formal for it. Miss Sullivan, I require tea. Chamomile, if you have it. Grace rose. Of course, Miss Blackwood. I'll prepare it right away. Eleanor didn't move from the doorway, her gaze traveling around the small room with open curiosity. You've worked in other households before this one? Yes, miss, in Cheyenne and Denver, most recently. And you have experience with infants? Something in Eleanor's tone made Grace cautious. I do. Eleanor nodded as if confirming a private suspicion. I saw my nephew earlier while you were preparing dinner. He seems adequately tended to. Thank you, miss. That wasn't a compliment, merely an observation. Eleanor's perfect posture somehow managed to become even more rigid. My sister would have wanted the best for her son, the very best governesses, tutors from the East, proper society influences. I'm sure Mr. Thornfield wants the same, Grace replied carefully. A flicker of something, or Ingmar's frustration crossed Eleanor's porcelain features. What Ethan wants and what Oliver needs may be two very different things. My sister made her choice when she married him and moved to this frontier. But Oliver's future remains unwritten. She fixed Grace with a penetrating stare. I'll be watching how you care for him, Miss Sullivan, very carefully. With that, Eleanor turned and glided back toward the main house, leaving Grace to follow with the promised tea. As she measured leaves into the pot, Grace reflected that Crawford's snake pit analogy had been remarkably apt. Whatever mourning Eleanor Blackwood was doing for her sister, it was wrapped tightly in layers of propriety, control, and barely concealed resentment. The question was, resentment toward whom? Ethan, this place, or something deeper? The next few days established an uneasy pattern. Eleanor inserted herself into every aspect of the household, inspecting cupboards, reorganizing the nursery, questioning Grace about Oliver's feeding and sleeping schedules. She brought gifts from Boston, tiny suits with sailor collars, silver rattles, illustrated books, all displayed with pointed remarks about proper beginnings. Ethan retreated further into his study, emerging only for meals, which were now taken in the formal dining room under Eleanor's insistence. Grace served these meals in silence, acutely aware of the tension between brother and sister-in-law, and equally aware of her position as both observer and subject of observation. Eleanor's comments were never openly hostile, but carried barbs nonetheless. The bread is surprisingly good, Miss Sullivan. One wouldn't expect such delicacy from such substantial hands. Or, Oliver seems quite attached to you. Children do form the oddest connections when proper family is absent. Grace weathered these remarks with outward calm, though each night she returned to her room with shoulders tight from the effort of maintaining her composure. On the fourth night of Eleanor's visit, Grace was awakened by sounds from the main house, a shout followed by the crash of something breaking. She slipped from her bed and pulled on her robe, concerned that Oliver might have been startled awake. The nursery was dark and quiet, Oliver still sleeping peacefully in his crib. But from Ethan's study came the murmur of voices, his and Eleanor's, engaged in a heated discussion. Grace knew she should return to her room. Eavesdropping on her employer was improper at best, grounds for dismissal at worst. But something in the urgency of their tones held her in place, just outside the partially open door. You're not fit to raise him, Eleanor was saying, her voice tight with anger. Look at yourself, Ethan. A doctor who can't practice. A man who can barely function. He's my son, Ethan replied, his voice low but firm. Victoria wanted him raised here, away from Boston society and its suffocating expectations. Victoria was confused, isolated. If she had stayed in Boston, surrounded by family and proper medical care, she might still be alive. A heavy silence followed this accusation. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was different, hollow, haunted. Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I don't relive that night every time I close my eyes? I was her husband, a doctor, and I couldn't save her. Because you've been broken since the war, Eleanor said, her tone softening slightly. The Ethan Thornfield who left for the battlefield never really returned. Victoria wrote to me about your nightmares, your refusal to practice medicine. She was worried about you. Victoria understood. She was too kind to say otherwise. Eleanor's voice hardened again. But I'm not. Oliver deserves better than a ghost for a father and a kitchen woman for a mother figure. Grace winced at the descriptor, but remained still, straining to hear Ethan's response. Miss Sullivan cares for him well. For now. But what happens when she leaves? They always leave, Ethan. Servants, especially in this godforsaken territory. And then what? Another stranger to care for your son while you hide in this room with your whiskey and regrets? The sound of footsteps approaching the door sent Grace retreating quickly toward the kitchen. She was at the stove, heating milk for tea, when Eleanor swept through. Still awake, Miss Sullivan? Eleanor asked, arching a perfect eyebrow. I heard a noise, Grace replied honestly. I was checking on Oliver. Eleanor studied her for a moment. How devoted you are, after so short a time. One might almost think you had personal reasons for such attachment. The implication hung in the air, clear and cutting. Eleanor was suggesting that Grace had designs on Ethan, on securing a position more permanent than cook. Grace met Eleanor's gaze steadily. I care for the child because he needs care, Miss Blackwood. Nothing more. Indeed? Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. Well, we'll see how long that lasts. Good night, Miss Sullivan. After Eleanor departed, Grace remained in the kitchen, hands trembling slightly as she poured her tea. The conversation she'd overheard played in her mind, revealing fault lines she hadn't fully appreciated before. Ethan, a doctor who no longer practiced. Victoria, dead during childbirth. Eleanor, convinced her sister would have survived in Boston. And Oliver, the innocent center of a grief so tangled it had become almost a living thing. Grace took her tea to the window, looking out at the vast Wyoming night. Stars scattered across the black sky like spilled sugar, more than she had ever seen in the city. The land stretched away into darkness, powerful in its emptiness. She had come here seeking a fresh start, a place where her past didn't define her. Instead, she had stepped into someone else's tragedy, still raw and unresolved. The sensible thing would be to leave at the first opportunity. And yet, she thought of Oliver's small weight in her arms, of Ethan's haunted blue eyes, even of Eleanor's brittle pride, masking pain. What would you do, Clara? She whispered to the night. But there was no answer, only the howl of a distant coyote, lonely and defiant against the darkness. Grace was kneading bread dough the next morning when she heard raised voices from the front of the house. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to investigate, concerned for Oliver, who was napping in a basket near the kitchen stove. In the main hallway, Eleanor stood face to face with Ethan, both of them rigid with anger. A trunk sat at Eleanor's feet, and her traveling clothes suggested an imminent departure. This discussion isn't over, Eleanor was saying. I'll be back in 1 month, and I expect to see improvement in how this household is run. Or what? Ethan challenged, a spark of the man he might once have been visible in his stance. Or I'll be forced to consider more formal measures regarding Oliver's future. Eleanor replied, her voice glacial. My family has connections, Ethan. Judges who would understand a concerned aunt's petition for guardianship, especially when the father is compromised. Ethan's face paled. You wouldn't dare. For Victoria's son, I would do whatever necessary. Eleanor softened slightly. I don't want to be your enemy, Ethan. I just want what's best for Oliver. He belongs with his father. Then be one, Eleanor said simply. She turned and noticed Grace hovering uncertainly in the hallway. Ah, Miss Sullivan, still with us, I see. How resilient of you. Grace said nothing, merely inclining her head in acknowledgement. Eleanor donned her gloves with practiced precision. Take care of my nephew, Miss Sullivan. I'll be checking on his progress when I return. With that, she swept out the door to where her carriage waited. Ethan remained motionless until the sound of wheels on gravel had faded. Then he turned and locked eyes with Grace. For a moment, something passed between them, a shared recognition of the storm that had blown through their lives and would certainly return. Then Ethan's face closed again, the brief connection severed. I'll be in my study, he said, turning away. Don't disturb me unless it's about Oliver. Grace returned to her bread making, but her mind was troubled. Eleanor's threats hadn't been idle, that much was clear, and Ethan, for all his intelligence and former status, seemed ill-equipped to fight for his son. He was, as Eleanor had brutally pointed out, a man diminished by grief and trauma. As she worked the dough with strong, sure movements, Grace made a decision. She had come to Thornfield Ranch for a job: cooking, cleaning, caring for a child. Simple, straightforward work. But it seemed that fate or providence or whatever force directed such things had placed her in the middle of a family fracturing under the weight of loss. She couldn't heal Ethan Thornfield's wounds or replace what he and Oliver had lost, but she could create order from chaos, nourishment from raw ingredients. She could tend the child with the love and attention he deserved. And perhaps, in doing so, she might help forge a bridge between father and son before Eleanor returned to drive them further apart. Grace shaped the dough into loaves, her movements purposeful. This was what she knew how to do: transform and nurture. One step at a time, one day at a time, until something broken became whole again. That night, long after the household had gone to sleep, Grace was awakened by sounds from the main house. Not angry voices this time, but something more disturbing. A cry, ragged and raw, like an animal in pain. She pulled on her robe and moved quickly through the darkened kitchen into the main house. The cries came from Ethan's study, punctuated by words she couldn't make out. The door was ajar, a sliver of moonlight cutting through the darkness within. Grace hesitated, then pushed it open further. Ethan lay on the leather couch against the far wall, still fully dressed, thrashing in the grip of a nightmare. His face was contorted in anguish, sweat gleaming on his brow despite the room's chill. "No," he moaned. "Hold pressure. Bleeding out. Can't stop it." Grace approached cautiously. "Mr. Thornfield?" He didn't hear her, lost in whatever horror his mind had conjured. "Too many," he gasped. "Too many wounds. Not enough hands." Grace reached out and touched his shoulder. "Ethan," she said firmly, "wake up. You're dreaming." His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. For a terrifying moment, he looked at her without recognition. Then awareness flooded back. He sat up abruptly, scrubbing a hand across his face. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice rough. "I apologize for disturbing you." "You didn't," she replied. "I was checking on Oliver and heard—" She trailed off, not wanting to embarrass him by naming his distress. Ethan swung his legs to the floor, putting distance between them. In the moonlight, he looked younger, more vulnerable, the careful facade of control stripped away by sleep. "It happens sometimes," he said flatly. "A remnant of the war." Grace nodded, understanding more than he might guess. "My father had similar dreams after he came back from fighting. The images don't leave easily." Ethan looked up, surprised by this personal revelation. "Your father was a soldier?" "With the Union Army. He came back different, quieter. Sometimes he'd wake up shouting names we didn't know." A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips. "And now you find yourself working for another broken soldier. Bad luck seems to follow you, Miss Sullivan." "I don't believe in luck, Mr. Thornfield. Only choices and their consequences." Ethan studied her for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. A practical philosophy, fitting for a practical woman. Grace moved to the small table where a pitcher of water stood. She poured a glass and offered it to him. "Drink. It helps after the dreams." He accepted the glass, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "You're very calm, Miss Sullivan. Most women would be fleeing in terror from a man shouting in his sleep." "I'm not most women," she replied simply, "as you've no doubt noticed." Again that ghost of a smile. "Indeed." He drank the water, then set the glass down carefully. "Eleanor told you about her threats, I assume." "Not directly, but I overheard." Ethan nodded, unsurprised by her honesty. "She believes I'm unfit to raise Oliver." "Perhaps she's right." "With respect, sir, that's nonsense," Grace said firmly. "You're his father." "A father who can't even hold his son without remembering that his birth killed his mother," Ethan said bitterly. "A doctor who can't practice medicine because his hands shake at the sight of blood." The confession seemed to surprise him as much as it did Grace. He looked away, embarrassed by the outburst. "I shouldn't burden you with this, Miss Sullivan. It's inappropriate." Sometimes the truth is inappropriate, Grace replied. Doesn't make it less true. Ethan glanced back at her, something new in his expression. Not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. Recognition. You're not what I expected, Miss Sullivan. Grace, she corrected gently. If we're to be inappropriate, we might as well use first names. This time his smile was real, if fleeting. Grace, then. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. You should return to your room. We both need rest. Grace nodded, understanding the dismissal. But at the door she paused, turning back. Mr. Thornfield, Ethan, you're not the man you were before the war. No one could be. But that doesn't mean you can't be a good father to Oliver. Different, but good. She left before he could respond, closing the door quietly behind her. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall for a moment, her heart beating too fast. What was she doing? Getting involved in her employer's personal struggles was precisely what she'd sworn to avoid after her last position ended badly. Professional distance was the key to survival and service. And yet, something about Ethan Thornfield's raw honesty had broken through her careful defenses. Perhaps because she recognized in him a fellow survivor, someone carrying wounds that wouldn't show on any medical chart. Grace returned to her room, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she sat by her small window, watching as the night sky gradually lightened to pearl gray, then blushed pink with the approaching dawn. A new day, another chance to choose, to act, to perhaps make some small difference in the fragile world of Thornfield Ranch. As autumn deepened toward winter, a routine established itself at the ranch. Grace rose early each day, prepared meals, tended to Oliver, and maintained the household with quiet efficiency. Ethan spent most days in his study or riding the property with Crawford, checking fences and cattle. The ranch hands went about their work, and the season turned, painting the prairie in shades of gold and russet. After the night of his nightmare, Ethan began to emerge from his self-imposed isolation. He took breakfast in the kitchen rather than his study, sometimes lingering over coffee while Grace kneaded bread or chopped vegetables for stew. Their conversations were brief at first, comments about the weather, reports on Oliver's growth, practical matters of household management. But gradually something shifted. Ethan started asking questions about her previous positions, her journey west, her knowledge of cooking and childcare. Grace answered honestly but selectively, sharing safe fragments of her past while keeping the painful parts hidden. In turn, she learned bits of his history, his education in Philadelphia, his mother's family ties to Wyoming. His brief practice in Boston before the war changed everything. Oliver thrived under Grace's care, growing plumper and more alert. His first tooth appeared, causing several fussy nights. Grace walked the floor with him, singing old Irish songs until he settled. Sometimes she would look up to find Ethan watching from the doorway, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. One crisp morning in late November, Grace was airing out the unused rooms on the second floor when she discovered a small wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what had been Victoria's sewing room. The box was locked, but the key hung on a ribbon tucked underneath. Grace knew she should leave it alone. Whatever it contained belonged to the dead woman, to privacy, to the past. But something, curiosity perhaps, or a deeper instinct, made her turn the tiny key in the lock. Inside lay a stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was elegant, masculine, and the name, James Reed, was not Ethan's. Grace's hands trembled as she untied the ribbon. She shouldn't read these. It was a violation of not just her position, but of basic decency. And yet, Eleanor's threats echoed in her mind. If there was something here that could harm Ethan's claim to his son, shouldn't she know? The first letter was dated 3 years earlier, soon after Victoria and Ethan had moved to Wyoming. My dearest Victoria, I think of you every day in that wilderness. Your last letter broke my heart. The loneliness you described, the emptiness of your days. You deserve so much more than a life buried in prairie dust. Married to a man who doesn't truly see you. Boston awaits your return. I await it with every beat of my heart. Our plans remain unchanged. When the time is right, you need only say the word, and I will come for you, forever yours, James. Grace quickly shuffled through the others. There were dozens, spanning years, growing increasingly passionate and explicit. James begging Victoria to leave Ethan. Victoria apparently responding with promises, excuses, delays. The final letter was dated just weeks before Oliver's birth. My Victoria, your news changes everything and nothing. A child, our child, growing within you. The timing couldn't be worse or more perfect. I'll be waiting in Denver as planned. Once the baby is born and you're strong enough to travel, send word. We'll go west to California where no one knows us. We can be a family without shame or secrecy. Thornfield need never know the truth. Let him believe the child is his. It will give you the freedom to leave without complications. He's too lost in his own demons to fight for you or notice the child isn't his. 3 more months, my love, and we'll be together forever. Yours in anticipation, James. Grace sank to the floor, the letters clutched in her hands, her mind racing. Oliver wasn't Ethan's son. Victoria had been planning to leave her husband for her lover, taking the baby with her. But something had gone wrong. Victoria had died in childbirth, her secrets dying with her. Or had they? Did Ethan know the truth? Did Eleanor? Was this the leverage Eleanor planned to use to take Oliver away? Grace carefully replaced the letters in the box, locked it, and returned it to its hiding place. Her heart pounded as she straightened the room, trying to erase any evidence of her discovery. As she descended the stairs, she nearly collided with Ethan, who was coming up. Grace, he said, steadying her with a hand on her arm. Is everything all right? You look pale. She forced a smile. Just dusty from cleaning the upstairs rooms. They've been neglected for too long. Ethan glanced past her, up the stairs toward what had been his wife's domain. Yes, I suppose they have. A shadow crossed his face. I haven't been up there since, I find them. Grace nodded, understanding. Some spaces hold memories too difficult to revisit. And some should be faced eventually, Ethan replied. He seemed about to say more, but Oliver's cry from the nursery interrupted whatever confession might have followed. I'll see to him, Grace said quickly, grateful for the escape. As she tended to the baby, Victoria's baby, James Reed's baby, Grace wrestled with her conscience. Should she tell Ethan what she'd found? Was it her place to shatter whatever peace he had managed to find? Or was her duty to protect Oliver's future, which might mean protecting Ethan from a truth that could destroy him and give Eleanor the ammunition she needed? Oliver gazed up at her with solemn eyes, blue eyes like Ethan's, though that must be coincidence. His tiny hand wrapped around her finger with surprising strength. What am I to do with you, little one? She whispered. What am I to do with all of these secrets? The baby had no answer, only a toothless smile that pierced her heart. In that moment, Grace made her decision. She would keep Victoria's secret, at least for now. Not for the dead woman's sake, but for the living. For Ethan, who had claimed this child as his own, and for Oliver, who deserved a father's love, regardless of blood. But she would be vigilant. Eleanor would return soon, and Grace needed to be prepared for whatever storm the elegant woman from Boston might bring with her. The first snow came early that year, dusting the prairie with white overnight and transforming Thornfield Ranch into a landscape from a fairy tale. Grace woke to find frost patterns on her window, delicate as lacework. The kitchen was cold, the fire having died down to embers during the night. As she stoked the stove back to life, she heard Oliver's morning babble from his crib in the small room adjacent to the kitchen. She had moved him there 2 weeks earlier, arguing that the nursery upstairs was too drafty as winter approached. Ethan hadn't objected, though Grace suspected his relief had less to do with practical concerns and more to do with the painful reminders that the formal nursery held. Good morning, little man, Grace said, lifting Oliver from his crib. He greeted her with a gummy smile and a pat on her cheek, his blue eyes bright with recognition. At 5 months old, he was becoming more responsive each day, tracking movements, reaching for objects, laughing at silly faces. Let's get you warm and fed, shall we? Then we'll show you your first snow. Grace changed and dressed him in the woolen clothes she had knitted during the evenings, then settled in the rocking chair by the stove to feed him his morning bottle. As Oliver drank, Grace found herself studying his features, searching for traces of James Reed in the tiny face. The shape of his eyes, perhaps, the set of his mouth, or was she imagining connections now that she knew the truth? The sound of boots on the porch interrupted her thoughts. The door opened, and Ethan stepped in, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the scent of pine. He had been spending more time outdoors lately, riding with Crawford or walking the property alone. The exercise had put some color back in his face, filled out his frame a bit. He looked more present, less like a ghost haunting his own home. "It's snowing at Ann," he announced, as if Grace couldn't see the white flakes clinging to his coat and hair. "So I see," she replied, smiling despite herself. There was something boyish in his obvious pleasure at the weather. Ethan shook off his coat and hung it by the door, then approached to look at Oliver. "How is he this morning?" "Hungry, as usual, growing stronger every day." Ethan nodded, watching as his son, not his son, Grace reminded herself, finished his bottle. "Crawford says we should expect a hard winter. The cattle are growing thick coats, and the squirrels have been gathering more than usual." "Then I'll need to make another trip to town for supplies," Grace said. "We're running low on flour and sugar, and I'd like to put up more preserves before the roads become impassable." "I'll take you," Ethan offered. "Tomorrow, if the snow holds off, Crawford can mind Oliver for a few hours." The suggestion startled Grace. In the 2 months she'd been at Thornfield Ranch, she had only gone to Carter's Hollow once, and that had been with Crawford to purchase kitchen supplies. The idea of traveling alone with Ethan stirred a confusing mix of emotions. "That's not necessary," she said carefully. "I'm sure you have more important matters to attend to." "More important than ensuring we don't starve through winter?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, a hint of his dry humor emerging. "Besides, there are some medical supplies I need. For Oliver," he added quickly, as if to clarify he wasn't returning to his practice. Grace nodded, recognizing that arguing would only make the situation more awkward. "Tomorrow, then. Thank you." Oliver, having finished his bottle, squirmed to be set down. Grace placed him on a blanket spread near the stove, where he immediately began batting at the colorful cloth balls she had sewn for him. Ethan lingered, watching the baby with a mixture of wonder and hesitation. "He's changed so much," he murmured, more to himself than to Grace. "Babies do," she replied, "especially in the first year." "I wouldn't know," Ethan admitted. "I delivered plenty during my practice, but never followed their development." Grace busied herself preparing breakfast, flapjacks with the last of the summer's blackberry preserves, to hide her surprise at this continuation of their conversation. Ethan rarely spoke about his time as a doctor. "What made you choose medicine?" she asked, keeping her tone casual as she mixed batter. Ethan was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was distant, reflective. "My father was a doctor, his father before him. It was expected, but I did love it, once. The human body is a marvel, so fragile in some ways, so resilient in others." He paused. "I specialized in difficult births, actually. There's nothing quite like placing a new life in a mother's arms." The irony of his words hung in the air between them. This man, who had once brought babies safely into the world, had been unable to save his wife during childbirth. Grace felt a renewed surge of guilt over her knowledge of Oliver's true parentage. "It must have been rewarding work," she said softly. It was. Ethan's gaze remained on Oliver, who had rolled onto his stomach and was attempting to push himself up, tiny face scrunched with effort. Until it wasn't. Before Grace could respond, Oliver let out a frustrated cry. Ethan hesitated, then moved to the blanket and knelt awkwardly beside his son. "Like this," he said, gently supporting Oliver's chest with one hand while demonstrating the motion with his other arm. "Push up with your hands. That's it." Oliver blinked up at Ethan, momentarily startled by this unexpected interaction with the man who usually observed him from a distance. Then, to Grace's amazement, the baby mimicked the motion, successfully pushing his upper body off the blanket for a few seconds before flopping down again. Ethan's face transformed with a genuine smile, the first Grace had seen from him. "Well done," he said to Oliver. "You're stronger than you look." Grace turned back to her cooking, giving them this moment of connection. Something warm unfurled in her chest, a feeling she couldn't or wouldn't name. Carter's Hollow in winter was a postcard scene. Clapboard buildings trimmed with snow, smoke rising from chimneys, pine boughs decorated for the coming Christmas season. The main street was quiet as Ethan guided the wagon through town the next morning, nodding at the few people braving the cold. Grace sat beside him, bundled in her heaviest coat and a woolen scarf. Despite the chill, she found herself enjoying the outing, the change of scenery after weeks of ranch routines. Oliver had remained at home with Crawford, who had revealed a surprising aptitude for baby minding. "We'll stop at Wilson's General Store first," Ethan said, pulling the wagon to a halt in front of a two-story building with a wide porch. "Martha Wilson keeps the best stock in the county. Her prices are fair, and she doesn't water down the molasses." "You seem to know a lot about grocery quality for a man," Grace observed as he helped her down from the wagon. Ethan's lips quirked. "I did most of the shopping after Victoria. She wasn't accustomed to frontier living, found it beneath her." The casual mention of his wife, the first time he had spoken of her so naturally, caught Grace off guard. Before she could respond, the store's door opened, and a stout woman with silver hair emerged, wiping her hands on a flour sack apron. "Ethan Thornfield, finally decided to rejoin the land of the living, have you?" Her voice was warm with affection, despite the blunt words. "Hello, Martha," Ethan replied with something close to fondness. "May I introduce Grace Sullivan? She's caring for Oliver and keeping us all fed at Thornfield Ranch." Martha Wilson's sharp eyes assessed Grace thoroughly. "About time you got proper help out there. That poor baby needs a woman's touch." She extended a work-roughened hand. "Welcome to Carter's Hollow, Miss Sullivan." "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson." Grace shook the offered hand, liking the straightforward woman immediately. "It's Widow Wilson, but Martha will do," she corrected. "Now come in out of this cold and tell me what brings you to town." Inside, the store was a treasure trove of necessities and small luxuries. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from sacks of flour to bolts of fabric, from patent medicines to penny candy. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat in the center of the room, surrounded by a few chairs where old men typically gathered to swap stories and complaints. Today, only one chair was occupied, by a woman in her 60s, with a face as weathered as an old saddle and eyes sharp as a hawk's. She nodded at Ethan but studied Grace with undisguised curiosity. "That's Ida Jenkins," Martha whispered to Grace. "Town gossip and midwife. Delivered half the babies in the county, including Ethan here." "Still remember it too?" Ida called out, her hearing apparently better than Martha had assumed. "Came out squalling like he was angry at the world. Some things don't change." Ethan shook his head, but Grace detected a hint of amusement beneath his exasperation. These women had known him his whole life, she realized. They had a claim to familiarity that transcended his current reserve. While Ethan discussed an order of lumber with Martha's son in the back room, Grace selected the supplies they needed: flour, sugar, coffee, dried fruits, spices, lamp oil, and a few modest luxuries like peppermint sticks for Christmas. "You settling in all right out there?" Martha asked as she tallied the items. "Thornfield Ranch can be a lonely place, especially in winter." "I'm quite comfortable, thank you," Grace replied, selecting a bolt of soft flannel for new baby clothes. Martha's gaze was shrewd. "You're good for him, you know, us, both of them. Ethan's looked half dead since Victoria passed, but today I see a spark back in his eyes." She leaned closer. "Don't let that intimidate you." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Mrs. Wilson, Martha, I'm simply the cook and nanny. There's nothing improper between Mr. Thornfield and myself." Martha's laugh was rich and knowing. "Didn't say there was, did I? But a man and a woman living under the same roof, sharing the care of a child. People will talk, especially after Eleanor Blackwood's last visit." Grace stiffened. "What do you mean?" Martha glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, though Ida Jenkins was watching with unconcealed interest from her perch by the stove. "Eleanor made quite a scene at the hotel during her stay," Martha confided, talking about taking the baby back east, saying her sister would never have wanted her son raised in wilderness obscurity by a broken man. Her words, not mine. Martha shook her head disapprovingly. "Victoria might have been Boston fancy, but she chose Ethan in this place. Eleanor never could accept that." The store bell jingled as the door opened, ending their conversation. A tall man entered, shaking snow from his hat, distinguished looking, in his early 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His coat was finer than most seen in Carter's Hollow, and his boots were polished despite the weather. "Dr. Lawrence," Martha greeted him. "What brings you out in this weather?" "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," the man replied, his voice cultured, with a hint of a New England accent. Just picking up some supplies before the next storm hits. His gaze fell on Grace and he nodded politely. Then he spotted Ethan emerging from the back room and his expression shifted. Recognition, surprise, and something more complex. "Thornfield," he said. "It's been a while." Ethan froze momentarily, then inclined his head in stiff acknowledgement. "Lawrence." The tension between the men was palpable. Grace looked from one to the other, sensing a history she wasn't privy to. "I heard about your wife," Dr. Lawrence said. "My condolences." "Thank you," Ethan replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "And the child, he's well?" "Yes." Dr. Lawrence seemed about to say more, but Ethan turned away, effectively ending the exchange. "Are you ready, Miss Sullivan? We should start back before the weather turns." Grace nodded, confused by the abrupt dismissal, but unwilling to question it in public. She thanked Martha, who promised to have her son deliver the larger supplies to the ranch the next day. As they left the store, Grace glanced back to find Dr. Lawrence watching them, his expression thoughtful. "Who was that?" she asked once they were settled in the wagon and heading out of town. Ethan's jaw was tight. "Andrew Lawrence. He took over my father's practice in Boston after the war. Moved out here last year for his wife's health." His hands gripped the reins too firmly. "We have a professional history." "He doesn't seem to bear you any ill will," Grace observed cautiously. "No, he wouldn't. Lawrence always was the bigger man." The bitterness in Ethan's voice was unmistakable. "He offered me a partnership when I returned from the war. I refused." "Because of your difficulties with medicine?" Ethan nodded, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "He knew about my condition. Suggested I could still be useful in diagnosis and treatment planning, even if I couldn't perform surgeries or attend births." "That sounds reasonable," Grace ventured. "It was charity," Ethan snapped. "Pity for the broken doctor with shaking hands. I didn't want it then, and I don't want it now." They rode in silence after that, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic breathing of the horses. The snow began to fall again, gentle flakes that caught in Ethan's hair and on the shoulders of his coat. Grace studied his profile surreptitiously, the strong line of his jaw beneath the beard, the furrow between his brows that never quite smoothed away, the way his mouth was set in a permanent line of determination or resignation, depending on the light. What would it be like, she wondered, if he smiled more often? If the weight of his past and Victoria's secrets didn't press so heavily on his shoulders? As if sensing her thoughts, Ethan glanced her way. "I apologize for my shortness. Lawrence is a reminder of things I'd rather forget." "We all have those," Grace said softly. "Reminders." Ethan's gaze lingered on her face, curious. "What are yours, Grace Sullivan? What ghosts follow you to Wyoming territory?" For a moment she considered telling him everything from about Clara, about the banker's son who had promised marriage then abandoned her when she became pregnant, about her family's rejection and her desperate journey west to escape scandal, about the fever that took her daughter when no doctor would attend a fallen woman's illegitimate child. But the wagon hit a rut in the road, jolting them both, and the moment passed. "Perhaps another time," she said, pulling her scarf tighter against the chill. "We should focus on reaching home before the snow worsens." Ethan nodded, respecting her reticence. "Another time," he agreed, and Grace couldn't tell if it was relief or disappointment she heard in his voice. The days shortened as December arrived, darkness falling by late afternoon and lingering until well past dawn. Grace filled the long evenings with mending, knitting, and baking, preparing for the Christmas season with quiet determination. She had always loved this time of year, even after her losses had tinged it with melancholy. Oliver continued to thrive, now sitting up with support and babbling a stream of consonants that occasionally resolved into something close to mama or baba-bum. Each new development was a small miracle that Grace recorded in a journal she kept hidden beneath her mattress, not because she feared discovery, but because the act of documenting his growth felt too personal, too maternal for her position as hired help. Ethan, too, was changing, emerging from his shell of grief and guilt, like a creature testing the air after a long hibernation. He spent more time with Oliver, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. He took meals with Grace in the kitchen rather than alone in his study. Sometimes in the evenings, he would read aloud from one of his books while Grace sewed and Oliver played on his blanket. scenes of domesticity that felt both natural and precarious. One evening, as the wind howled around the eaves and snow piled against the windows, Grace was teaching Oliver a simple game of peekaboo when Ethan entered the kitchen, his arms full of parcels. "What's all this?" Grace asked, rising from her place on the floor beside Oliver. "I had Crawford pick up a few things in town," Ethan replied, setting the packages on the table. "Christmas presents, mainly, for Oliver. And, well, this one is for you." He held out a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Grace accepted it with surprise, holding it carefully as if it might bite. "You didn't need to." "I wanted to," Ethan interrupted. "You've done so much for us. For Oliver and me. It's just a small token of appreciation." Grace untied the string with fingers that trembled slightly. Inside the paper was a book, a collection of Irish folk tales and poems, beautifully bound in green cloth with silver's lettering. "I noticed you singing those Irish lullabies to Oliver," Ethan explained, watching her face. "Martha mentioned you might appreciate something from the old country." Grace ran her fingers over the embossed cover, touched beyond measure by the thoughtfulness of the gift. No employer had ever given her a personal present before, let alone one that showed such attention to her heritage and interest. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." Their eyes met over the book, and something shifted in the air between them. A recognition, an acknowledgement of the strange, tentative bond that had formed during these months of shared care for Oliver and quiet coexistence. The moment was broken by Oliver's demanding squeal as he toppled sideways, frustrated by his inability to maintain his sitting position. Grace quickly set down the book and righted him, earning a toothless grin for her efforts. "He's getting stronger," Ethan observed, kneeling beside them. "Soon he'll be crawling, and then walking. Nothing in the house will be safe." "We'll need to make some adjustments," Grace agreed. "Move the breakables higher, secure the stairs." "We," Ethan echoed, a curious expression crossing his face. "You speak as if you'll still be here then." Grace froze, suddenly aware of her presumption. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply." "No, don't apologize." Ethan's voice was gentle. "I hope you will be here. Oliver needs consistency, stability." "And what about you?" The question slipped out before Grace could stop it. "What do you need, Ethan?" The directness of her query seemed to startle him. He looked away, focusing on Oliver, who was attempting to reach a wooden block just beyond his grasp. "I need—" He paused, struggling to articulate something he perhaps had never allowed himself to consider. "I need to be the father Oliver deserves. I need to find my way back to some kind of purpose." He helped Oliver reach the block, guiding the tiny hand to close around it. The baby immediately brought it to his mouth, gumming it enthusiastically. "Everything tastes better when you're teething, doesn't it, little man?" Ethan murmured with a tenderness that made Grace's heart constrict. She watched them together, this man and this child, bound not by blood but by circumstance and choice. The secret of Oliver's parentage weighed on her conscience, but in moments like this, it seemed less important than the reality before her eyes. Ethan was Oliver's father in all the ways that truly mattered. The kitchen door opened suddenly, admitting a blast of cold air and a snow-covered T. Crawford. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, stamping his boots on the mat, "but we've got trouble. One of the pregnant heifers is down in the south pasture. Looks like she's calving early, and it's a difficult presentation." Ethan straightened immediately. "How bad?" "Bad enough. Jenkins is trying to turn the calf, but he's not having much luck. Says we might lose both of them without help." Grace saw the conflict in Ethan's face, the instinct to help warring with the fear that had kept him from practicing medicine since the war. "I'm not a veterinarian, Crawford," Ethan said stiffly. "Jenkins has more experience with cattle than I do." Crawford's expression didn't change, but disappointment radiated from him. "Right, of course. I'll tell him to do his best." He turned to go. "Wait," Grace said impulsively. "I'll come help. I've assisted with difficult births before." Both men stared at her in surprise. "It's freezing out there," Ethan protested, "and the south pasture is a mile away." "I'm stronger than I look," Grace replied, already reaching for her coat, "and I know how to turn a breech calf. My uncle had a farm in Pennsylvania." Crawford looked to Ethan, who hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Take my heavy coat at least. And the mare, she's steadier in the snow." Grace bundled up quickly, wrapping a woolen scarf around her head and pulling on Ethan's coat, which enveloped her like a tent. I'll be back as soon as I can. Oliver's just been fed, so he should sleep for a while. We'll be fine, Ethan assured her, though uncertainty flashed in his eyes. Not about his ability to care for Oliver, Grace realized, but about her safety in the storm. The concern warmed her as she followed Crawford out into the swirling snow. The south pasture was a white wasteland, visibility reduced to just a few yards in the strengthening blizzard. Crawford led the way, a lantern held high to guide their horses through the drifts. They finally reached a stand of pines where the ranch hands had created a makeshift shelter for the laboring heifer. "About time," growled Jenkins, a grizzled old cowboy with hands like leather and a vocabulary to match. "She's fading fast, and the calf's twisted all wrong." Grace dismounted and approached the heifer, who lay on her side, sides heaving, eyes rolling in distress. The men had done their best to make her comfortable, spreading straw beneath her and rigging a canvas tarp overhead to block the worst of the snow. "Let me see," Grace said, removing her mittens and rolling up her sleeves. She knelt beside the animal, speaking soothingly as she examined her. "How long has she been in labor?" "Found her about 3 hours ago," Jenkins replied. "Already straining then. I tried to turn the calf, but its shoulders hung up on the pelvis." Grace nodded, feeling the contours of the calf through the heifer's flank. "I need hot water to warm my hands, and something slick, oil or soap." Crawford produced a flask of whiskey. "This is the best we've got for disinfectant." Grace accepted it with a nod and poured a generous amount over her hands. Then, taking a deep breath, she reached inside the heifer to assess the calf's position. The next hour was a blur of effort, concentration, and increasingly desperate measures. The calf was indeed twisted, one foreleg back, head turned at an impossible angle. Grace worked methodically, speaking constantly to the exhausted mother, repositioning the calf inch by agonizing inch. "We're losing her," Jenkins warned, as the heifer's breathing became more labored. "Might have to choose, mother or calf." "Not yet," Grace insisted, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cold. "If I can just—" There. With a final push and pull, she felt the calf shift into proper position. "Now," she called to Crawford, "pull with the next contraction." Crawford gripped the calf's protruding legs, pulled steadily as the heifer gave a mighty push. Suddenly the resistance gave way, and the calf slid into the world, wet, steaming in the cold air, and miraculously alive. "Well, I'll be damned," Jenkins muttered, genuine respect in his voice. "Never seen hands that gentle work that strong." Grace ignored the comment, focusing on clearing the calf's airways and rubbing it vigorously with straw to stimulate its circulation. The tiny creature sputtered, then let out a weak bleat. "Get him to his mother," she directed. "She needs to lick him dry, and he needs to nurse as soon as possible." As the men tended to the cow and calf, Grace sat back on her heels, exhausted but exhilarated. Her arms ached, her back screamed with tension, and her fingers were numb from cold and exertion. But the satisfaction of saving 2 lives outweighed all discomfort. "You're full of surprises, Miss Sullivan," Crawford said, handing her a canteen of water. "Where did a cook learn to deliver calves like that?" Grace took a deep drink before answering. "My uncle's farm, like I said. There was a bad year when the local veterinarian was overwhelmed. I helped where I could." What she didn't add was that she had also assisted midwives in Philadelphia before her fall from grace, watching, learning, developing the skills that might have saved her own daughter if fate and society had been kinder. "Well, the boss should have seen you," Crawford said, helping her to her feet. "Might have reminded him what it feels like to make a difference." Grace brushed straw from her skirts, suddenly eager to return to the warmth of the ranch house. To Oliver and Ethan, "We should head back before the storm worsens." The ride back was slower, their path nearly obliterated by fresh snow. By the time they reached the ranch, Grace was chilled to the bone despite Ethan's heavy coat. Her muscles trembled with fatigue, and her head pounded from the combination of exertion and cold. The kitchen was a haven of warmth and light after the howling darkness outside. Ethan sat at the table, Oliver asleep in his arms, a medical book open before him. He looked up as Grace entered, relief washing over his features. "You're back," he said, then frowned as he took in her exhausted state. "Are you all right? How is the heifer?" Both mother and calf survived, Grace replied, struggling to remove her frozen boots. Her fingers were too numb to manage the laces. Ethan carefully laid Oliver in his cradle, then moved to help her, kneeling to unlace the boots while Grace steadied herself against the wall. "You're freezing," he observed, concern deepening the lines around his eyes. "And your hands, they're raw." Indeed, Grace's hands were red and chapped, with small cuts from the heifer's pelvic bones. She hadn't noticed the injuries in the intensity of the moment. "It's nothing," she dismissed. "Just need to warm up a bit." Ethan frowned. "Sit down, by the stove, now." His tone brooked no argument, and Grace was too tired to protest. She sank into the rocking chair while Ethan busied himself heating water and gathering supplies from a cabinet she hadn't seen him open before. "Your medical kit," she observed as he returned with bandages, ointment, and a bottle of antiseptic. "Just the basics," he replied. "I still keep some supplies for emergencies." He poured the warm water into a basin and knelt before her. "Give me your hands." Grace hesitated, suddenly self-conscious about her work-roughened hands with their broken nails and calluses, so different from the delicate, pampered hands Victoria must have had. "They're not pretty," she warned. "They're capable," Ethan countered, "and injured. Let me help you, Grace, as you've helped me." The use of her given name, spoken with such gentle insistence, broke through her resistance. She extended her hands, watching as he carefully immersed them in the warm water. His touch was professional, yet tender as he cleaned the cuts, applied antiseptic that stung despite his gentleness, then smoothed ointment over the damaged skin. "Crawford told me what you did," Ethan said as he worked. "He said you were remarkable." Grace kept her eyes on their hands, hers, sturdy and practical, his, long-fingered, and surprisingly elegant despite their strength. "I just did what needed doing." "You saved 2 lives tonight." Ethan's voice was low, almost reverent. "I should have been there. Should have helped." "Why weren't you?" Grace asked, the question escaping before she could consider its wisdom. Ethan's hands stilled briefly, then continued bandaging a deeper cut on her palm. "Fear," he admitted. "The same fear that keeps me from practicing medicine on humans. The fear of failure, of blood on my hands. Even though you might have succeeded, might have saved them." Even then, he secured the bandage with a small knot. "The possibility of failure has become paralyzing." Grace understood then, not just intellectually but in her heart, the depth of Ethan's trauma. It wasn't simply that he had witnessed horrors in the war or that he had lost his wife in childbirth. It was that these experiences had fundamentally altered his relationship with his own abilities, his own courage. "The heifer and calf might have died without help," she said softly, "but they definitely would have died without any attempt. Sometimes the attempt itself is the victory, Ethan, regardless of the outcome." He looked up from his ministrations, his blue eyes searching her face as if seeing her anew. "Is that how you live, Grace Sullivan? Making the attempt despite the risk of failure?" The question cut close to her carefully guarded heart. "No," she wanted to say. "I ran from failure. I ran from scandal and judgment. I've been hiding in kitchens and nurseries, playing it safe." But that wasn't entirely true, was it? She had taken risks, coming west alone, accepting positions with strangers, opening herself to new rejection with each new beginning. And most recently, allowing herself to care for Oliver and, if she were honest, for Ethan as well. "I try," she answered finally. "Some days better than others." Ethan nodded, seemingly satisfied with her honesty. He finished tending her hands, then rose and put away his medical supplies. When he returned, he carried 2 mugs of hot cider spiced with cinnamon and cloves. "For the chill," he explained, pressing one into her bandaged hands. They sat in companionable silence, sipping the warming drink as the storm raged outside and Oliver slept peacefully nearby. It was a moment of perfect contentment, made more precious by its unexpectedness and fragility. "Christmas is in 2 weeks," Ethan remarked after a while. "Oliver's first. I'd like to make it special, despite our isolation here." "We could put up a small tree," Grace suggested. "Make decorations from paper and ribbons. I could bake cookies and gingerbread. And perhaps," Ethan hesitated, "perhaps we could invite a few people for Christmas dinner. Crawford, of course, Martha Wilson if she's willing to make the journey. Even old Ida Jenkins, though she'll probably complain about everything from the gravy to the weather. Grace smiled at the thought of the crusty midwife critiquing her cooking. That sounds lovely. A proper Christmas celebration. What neither of them said, but both understood, was that this would be the first Christmas since Victoria's death, a milestone in grief that Ethan was choosing to mark not with isolation, but with tentative steps toward community and joy. I should check on the calf again before turning in, Ethan said, rising from his chair. Will you be all right? Your hands. I'll manage, Grace assured him. Go. Make your attempt. The smile he gave her then, small but genuine, with a spark of his former self shining through the grief, was worth all the cold and exhaustion of the night's adventure. After he left, Grace sat for a long time by the stove, watching the flames dance behind the iron grate and listening to Oliver's soft breathing. The secret of his parentage still weighed on her, but tonight it seemed less urgent, less threatening. Whatever James Reed might have been to Victoria, Oliver was Ethan's son in the ways that mattered most. And Grace? What was she to them both? Cook, nanny, helper, yes, all of those, but something more was developing, something she hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure she should welcome. She flexed her bandaged hands, wincing at the sting of healing cuts. These hands had delivered a calf tonight. They had cradled Oliver countless times, and they had been tended by Ethan Thornfield with a gentleness that spoke of respect, perhaps even admiration. Dangerous thoughts for a woman in her position, especially with Eleanor Blackwood's return looming like a storm cloud on the horizon. The Christmas celebration at Thornfield Ranch was modest but heartfelt. A small pine tree cut from the property and decorated with paper stars, dried berries, and the few glass ornaments that had survived the journey west years earlier. Grace baked for days, filling the house with the scents of cinnamon, ginger, and vanilla. Oliver, now nearing 6 months, watched the preparations with wide-eyed fascination, particularly drawn to the colorful lights of the candles, kept well out of his reach. Martha Wilson braved the snow to join them, arriving Christmas Eve with armfuls of packages and a basket of preserves. Ida Jenkins came too, grumbling about the cold but bringing a hand-knitted blanket for Oliver and bottles of her famous elderberry cordial. Crawford, dressed in his Sunday best, presented Oliver with a carved wooden horse that he'd been working on for weeks in the barn after his duties were done. Even Andrew Lawrence made a brief appearance, delivering a jar of specially formulated teething powder for Oliver and exchanging a stiff but civil conversation with Ethan. The tension between them remained, but Grace noticed Ethan making an effort to be cordial, a small victory that she quietly celebrated. The day passed in a blur of food, laughter, and simple gifts exchanged among friends who were becoming something like family. It was, Grace thought as she washed dishes that evening, the happiest Christmas she had experienced in years. Not because of any particular extravagance, but because of the genuine warmth that had filled the once cold house. Ethan seemed to feel it too. After their guests departed and Oliver was put to bed, he lingered in the kitchen, helping Grace clean up despite her protests. You don't need to do that, she said as he dried a serving platter. It's Christmas. You should rest. I want to help, he replied simply. Besides, I'm not quite ready for the day to end. Grace understood the sentiment. There was a magic to the holiday that made one wish to prolong it, to hold the happiness close before ordinary life resumed. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of dishes and the crackling of the stove. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, adding another layer to the white blanket covering the ranch. I have something for you, Ethan said suddenly, setting down his towel. I didn't want to give it to you in front of the others. He left briefly and returned with a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. It was larger than the book he had given her before, and oddly shaped. Ethan, you've already been too generous, Grace protested. Open it, he urged, a rare hint of eagerness in his voice. Grace carefully untied the ribbon and unwrapped the paper to reveal a wooden box with a hinged lid. It was beautifully crafted from polished walnut, with a simple design of ivy leaves carved around the edges. It's beautiful, she said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Open the box, Ethan prompted. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a stethoscope, not a new one, but clearly well cared for, its brass and rubber components gleaming in the lamplight. "It was my first," Ethan explained. "From medical school. I thought, well, I've seen how you worry about Oliver's breathing when the weather turns cold. I thought you might want a way to listen, to reassure yourself." Grace lifted the instrument carefully, touched beyond words by the thoughtfulness of the gift. It wasn't a piece of jewelry or a frivolous trinket, but a practical tool that acknowledged her concern for Oliver, while also representing a significant piece of Ethan's past. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Thank you seems inadequate." "You don't need to say anything." Ethan's voice was soft. "You've brought life back to this house, Grace. To Oliver. To me. This is a small token compared to that gift." Their eyes met over the open box, and something unspoken passed between them. An acknowledgement of the bond that had formed, unexpected and unplanned, through their shared care of Oliver and the quiet rhythms of their days together. The moment was broken by Oliver's cry from the nursery. Not urgent, just the fussing of a baby who had awoken and wanted attention. Grace set down the stethoscope and moved toward the sound, but Ethan touched her arm lightly. "I'll go," he said. "Finish your tea. It's Christmas after all." As she watched him walk away, Grace felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove's heat or the spiced tea she'd been drinking. It was a feeling she'd nearly forgotten, the quiet joy of being seen, truly seen, by another person. But with that joy came a shadow of apprehension. Eleanor Blackwood would return soon, as she had promised, and Grace still carried the secret of Oliver's parentage, a secret that could destroy the fragile happiness they had built. January arrived with bitter cold and howling winds that confined them mostly to the house. Oliver grew more active each day, now able to sit independently and beginning to drag himself across the floor in a determined army crawl that had Grace constantly vigilant. Ethan continued his gradual emergence from grief, spending more time with Oliver and taking a renewed interest in the ranch operations. He even began to consult his medical books again, though he insisted it was only to better understand Oliver's development and needs. Grace noticed other changes as well. Ethan had taken to shaving regularly, trimming his beard to a neater style that accentuated the strong line of his jaw. He ate better, regaining some of the weight he had lost after Victoria's death. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught him watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. It was dangerous territory, these unspoken feelings developing between them. Grace reminded herself daily of the realities. She was an employee, a woman with a scandalous past, and he was her employer, a man still legally bound to the memory of his wife. Add to that the secret she kept about Oliver's true parentage, and the situation became impossible. Yet still her treacherous heart quickened when Ethan entered a room. Still she found herself taking extra care with her appearance, pinching color into her cheeks and arranging her hair more carefully each morning. The situation might have continued in this delicate balance indefinitely, had fate not intervened in the form of a telegram delivered by a half-frozen courier one bitter January afternoon. "Urgent message for Mr. Thornfield," the young man stammered, his lips blue with cold. "Road from town special. Station master said it couldn't wait." Grace ushered him in, sat him by the stove with hot coffee, and sent one of the ranch hands to fetch Ethan from the barn, where he was helping Crawford mend harnesses. When Ethan arrived, snow dusting his shoulders and concern etched on his face, the courier handed over the telegram with visible relief at having completed his mission. Grace busied herself with Oliver, trying not to watch too obviously as Ethan read the message. But she couldn't miss how the color drained from his face, how his hands tightened on the paper until it crumpled at the edges. "What is it?" she asked when the courier had departed. Warmed and rewarded for his efforts. "Bad news?" Ethan looked up, his expression a mixture of anger and apprehension. "Eleanor is coming, tomorrow, with a lawyer from Cheyenne." Grace's stomach dropped. "A lawyer? Why?" "The telegram doesn't say. Only that they'll arrive on the afternoon train and expect accommodations to be prepared." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had come to recognize. This is it, then. She's making good on her threat to seek guardianship of Oliver. "She can't possibly succeed," Grace said, though doubt gnawed at her. "You're his father. You've done nothing wrong." Ethan's bitter laugh held no humor. "Haven't I? I'm a doctor who doesn't practice, a widower who spent months in a haze of grief while others cared for his child. Eleanor will paint me as unstable, negligent, and her family has connections, influence. But Oliver is thriving. Anyone can see that. Thanks to you, Ethan pointed out, which Eleanor will undoubtedly twist to suggest I'm incapable of providing proper care myself. Grace sat down heavily. Oliver balanced on her lap. The baby reached for her face, patting her cheek as if sensing her distress. "What can we do?" she asked. Ethan paced the kitchen, energy radiating from him like heat from the stove. "Prepare for battle," he said grimly. "The house must be immaculate. Oliver at his best. I'll ride to town immediately to speak with Judge Parker. He's known my family for years. Perhaps he can offer advice." "I'll start cleaning," Grace said, rising, "and I'll prepare the guest rooms. Perhaps Eleanor will be more reasonable if she sees how well things are going here." Ethan paused in his pacing, his expression softening as he looked at her. "Grace, you should know, this could get ugly. Eleanor might say things, imply things about your position here." Grace understood his meaning immediately. The unmarried female employee living under the same roof as the widowed employer. It was a situation ripe for gossip and insinuation regardless of the actual propriety of their conduct. "I'm not afraid of Eleanor Blackwood's opinions," she said firmly. "My concern is for Oliver and for you." Ethan crossed to her in 2 quick strides, taking her free hand in both of his. "You are remarkable, Grace Sullivan," he said, his voice low with an emotion she dared not name. "Whatever happens tomorrow, know that I—" Oliver chose that moment to grab a fistful of Grace's hair and tug enthusiastically, breaking the tension with his happy gurgle. Ethan stepped back, the unfinished declaration hanging between them. "I should go to town before the weather worsens," he said. "Will you be all right here alone?" Grace nodded, disentangling Oliver's fingers from her hair. "We'll be fine. Go." After Ethan left, Grace set to work with the energy of anxiety, scrubbing floors, polishing furniture, washing windows despite the freezing temperatures outside. She bathed Oliver and laid out his best clothes for the next day. She prepared elaborate menus to showcase her culinary skills and the excellent management of the household. But as she worked, doubt crept in like the winter chills seeping through the window frames. What if Eleanor succeeded? What if Oliver was taken away to Boston? The thought was unbearable. And even if Eleanor failed in her legal efforts, the tension of her visit might destroy the delicate new happiness that had begun to grow at Thornfield Ranch. Ethan, confronted again with reminders of Victoria and pressured about his fitness as a father, might retreat once more into grief and isolation. As darkness fell, Grace found herself standing in the nursery, watching Oliver sleep peacefully in his crib. She reached down to stroke his cheek, marveling at the perfect softness of his skin. "What am I to do, little one?" she whispered. "The truth could save you from Eleanor's schemes, but at what cost to your father? To your future?" The secret she had kept for months now weighed more heavily than ever. If Oliver wasn't Ethan's biological son, Eleanor's claim might be strengthened, not weakened. But if Ethan learned the truth, that Victoria had planned to leave him, that Oliver was another man's child, would it destroy him? Would it destroy whatever was growing between Ethan and Grace? There were no easy answers, only the soft sound of Oliver's breathing and the howl of the wind outside, promising that tomorrow would bring a storm in more ways than one. Eleanor Blackwood arrived with the precision of a military campaign, stepping down from the rented carriage at exactly 3 o'clock the following afternoon. She wore a traveling suit of charcoal gray, severe and elegant, with a fur-trimmed coat and hat that spoke of Boston wealth and taste. Behind her came a thin man in a black coat clutching a leather portfolio, his spectacles glinting in the winter sun. Grace watched their approach from the kitchen window, her stomach knotted with apprehension. Oliver was napping, and Ethan had positioned himself on the porch, a welcoming committee of one, his posture rigid with determination. "Miss Sullivan," Eleanor acknowledged coolly when she entered the house. "Still with us, I see." "Miss Blackwood," Grace replied with a polite nod. "May I take your coat? There's hot tea ready in the parlor." "How domestic," Eleanor remarked, handing over her expensive coat and gloves. "You've certainly made yourself at home here." The lawyer, introduced as Mr. Harrington of the firm Harrington and Wells, offered Grace a distracted smile as he followed Eleanor to the parlor. where Ethan waited with barely concealed tension. Grace busied herself serving tea and freshly baked scones, acutely aware of being assessed by both Eleanor and the lawyer. She had dressed with care in her best dress, a deep blue wool that, while simple, was neat and becoming. Her hair was pinned up in a modest style, and she had scrubbed her hands until they were as presentable as years of hard work would allow. "I must say the place looks better than during my last visit," Eleanor conceded, accepting a cup of tea, "though I suppose appearances can be deceiving." "Why don't we dispense with the pleasantries, Eleanor?" Ethan said, his voice controlled but edged with steel. "Why have you brought a lawyer to my home?" Mr. Harrington cleared his throat, setting down his teacup with a precise click. "Perhaps I can explain, Mr. Thornfield. Miss Blackwood has engaged our firm to explore legal options regarding the guardianship and future care of Oliver Thornfield." "My son is not a legal matter," Ethan said flatly. "He is my child, in my care, in my home." "Indeed," Harrington agreed smoothly. "However, concerns have been raised about the environment in which the child is being raised, the lack of proper educational opportunities, the isolation, the absence of a maternal influence of appropriate social standing. Oliver is 6 months old," Ethan pointed out. "Harvard can wait a few years." Eleanor sighed, the sound theatrical in its exasperation. "Always so flippant, Ethan. This isn't about education. Not yet. It's about what Victoria would have wanted for her son. And you presume to know that better than I, her husband?" Ethan's voice remained even, but Grace could see the tension in his jaw. "I knew my sister all her life," Eleanor replied. "You knew her for 5 years, the last 2 of which she spent isolated in this wilderness while you retreated into yourself." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Grace, feeling like an intruder in this family conflict, moved to leave, but Ethan's voice stopped her. "Stay, Grace, please. This concerns you as well, since your care of Oliver is apparently part of Eleanor's complaint." Eleanor's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. "Not a complaint, exactly. Miss Sullivan seems competent enough, but a hired cook is hardly the maternal figure Oliver needs. Victoria would have wanted him raised among family, with the advantages of proper society." "Like a cold, judgmental aunt who visits twice a year," Ethan challenged. "Better than a father who can barely function and depends on household staff to raise his child," Eleanor shot back, her composure cracking slightly. Mr. Harrington intervened smoothly. "Perhaps we could speak more productively about arrangements that would benefit all parties. Miss Blackwood is prepared to offer very generous terms, Mr. Thornfield." "Terms?" Ethan repeated incredulously. "For my son?" "Visitation rights," Harrington clarified. "Summer visits to Wyoming, once the boy is old enough to travel safely. Regular correspondence. Miss Blackwood has no desire to sever your relationship with Oliver, merely to ensure he receives the upbringing his mother would have wanted." Grace watched the color drain from Ethan's face as the reality of what they were proposing sank in. They weren't just threatening legal action. They were offering a settlement, as if Oliver's custody was a business transaction to be negotiated. "And if I refuse these generous terms?" Ethan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Harrington adjusted his spectacles. "Then Miss Blackwood is prepared to petition the court for full guardianship on the grounds of your medical incapacity." "Medical incapacity?" Ethan repeated. "Your condition since the war," Eleanor said, almost gently. "The tremors, the nightmares, your refusal to practice medicine. Victoria wrote to me about all of it, Ethan. She was worried about you, about your ability to function." "Get out." Ethan's voice was low, controlled, but vibrating with anger. "Get out of my house, both of you." Eleanor didn't move. "We have a hearing scheduled with Judge Parker next week. This visit was a courtesy, a chance for you to consider our offer before things become public." "A courtesy?" Ethan laughed bitterly. "You threatened to take my son and call it courtesy?" "I'm trying to do what's best for Victoria's child," Eleanor insisted. "Can you honestly say that this ranch, this isolation, is what she would have wanted for him?" Before Ethan could respond, a cry came from the nursery. Oliver, awake from his nap and demanding attention. The sound seemed to electrify the room, a reminder of the very real child at the center of this conflict. "I'll get him," Grace said quietly, grateful for an excuse to escape the tension. "No," Eleanor said, rising. "I'd like to see my nephew, if you don't mind, Miss Sullivan." It wasn't really a request. Grace glanced at Ethan, who gave a tight nod. "The nursery is this way," she said, leading Eleanor through the house. Oliver was sitting up in his crib, his face brightening when he saw Grace. He bounced excitedly, reaching out with eager hands. Grace lifted him, soothing his fussiness with practiced ease, acutely aware of Eleanor watching their interaction. "He knows you well," Eleanor observed, her tone unreadable. "I've cared for him since he was 4 months old," Grace replied, changing Oliver's damp diaper with efficient movements. Eleanor approached, studying Oliver with genuine affection, softening her sharp features. "He has Victoria's eyes, her chin too." She reached out, touching his cheek with a gloved finger. "Hello, little one. Do you remember your Aunt Eleanor?" Oliver regarded her curiously, neither accepting nor rejecting her attention. Grace finished dressing him in fresh clothes, then, following an impulse she couldn't quite explain, offered him to Eleanor. "Would you like to hold him?" Eleanor hesitated, then removed her gloves and accepted the baby. Her posture was stiff, her hold awkward, but there was real tenderness in her expression as she looked at Oliver. "He's thriving," she admitted reluctantly. "You've done well with him, Miss Sullivan." "Ethan has done well with him," Grace corrected gently. "He may not show it to you, but he's devoted to Oliver. He reads to him every night, helps with his baths, encourages his development. He's a good father, Miss Blackwood." Eleanor's gaze sharpened. "You seem very convinced of my brother-in-law's virtues, Miss Sullivan. One might almost think your interest extends beyond professional concern." The implication was clear, and Grace felt her cheeks warm. "My concern is for Oliver. And yes, for his father, who loves him dearly and is doing his best after a terrible loss." Eleanor murmured, returning her attention to the baby. "And what of Victoria? Does anyone here remember her, honor her wishes for her child?" "We do," Grace said firmly, "every day, in giving Oliver the love and stability he needs." Eleanor studied Grace for a long moment, her expression calculating. "You're not what I expected, Miss Sullivan. Not the first time we met, and not now." "What did you expect?" "Someone less formidable." Eleanor handed Oliver back, her momentary softness receding. "But it doesn't change the facts. Oliver belongs with family, in Boston, with all the advantages Victoria would have wanted for him." "He has family here," Grace insisted. "Ethan is his father." Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes, a hesitation, a momentary uncertainty, before her resolve hardened once more. "We'll let the court decide that, Miss Sullivan. Good day." She swept from the nursery, leaving Grace with a squirming Oliver and a growing dread in the pit of her stomach. The brief connection they had shared over the baby had changed nothing. Eleanor was still determined to take Oliver away, and the hearing was only a week away. Grace returned to the parlor to find Ethan and Mr. Harrington engaged in tense discussion about legal precedents and paternal rights. Eleanor stood by the window, her profile sharp against the winter light. "I've prepared a room for you and Mr. Harrington," Grace said, interrupting their debate. "The weather is turning, and the road to town may become impassable by evening." Eleanor turned, surprise evident on her face. "You're offering us accommodation? After this?" "You're still family," Ethan said, though the words clearly cost him. "And Grace is right about the weather. I won't have your blood on my hands if you insist on traveling in a blizzard." "How dramatically gallant," Eleanor remarked, but her tone lacked its usual bite. "Very well, we accept your hospitality, though I think separate rooms would be more appropriate. Mr. Harrington can take the sofa in the study." "As you wish," Grace agreed, adjusting Oliver on her hip. "Dinner will be at 6. If you'll excuse me, I need to see to the preparations." In the kitchen, safely away from the tense atmosphere of the parlor, Grace sat heavily at the table, bouncing Oliver on her knee while her mind raced. The situation was worse than she had feared. Eleanor wasn't just making threats. She had a lawyer, a court date, and apparently letters from Victoria documenting Ethan's struggles after the war. Oliver grabbed at Grace's apron strings, babbling cheerfully, oblivious to the adult concerns swirling around him. His innocence, his complete trust in the world to care for him, made Grace's heart ache. This child, who had already lost his mother, might now lose the only home and father he had known. Unless the thought that had been hovering at the edges of Grace's mind for weeks now crystallized into clarity. She could reveal the truth about Oliver's parentage. The letters from James Reed would prove that Eleanor had no biological claim to Oliver either. It would be devastating for Ethan to learn he wasn't Oliver's father by blood, but perhaps less devastating than losing him altogether. But then another thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. What if the truth had the opposite effect? If Ethan learned Oliver wasn't his biological son, would he still fight for him with the same determination? And even if he did, would the court still recognize his paternal rights? The legal complexities were beyond Grace's understanding, but the human elements were not. Ethan loved Oliver as his son, regardless of blood, and Oliver needed Ethan, his stability, his growing confidence as a father, his genuine love. The sound of footsteps interrupted her deliberations. Ethan entered the kitchen, his face drawn with worry and anger. When he saw Grace and Oliver, however, some of the tension left his shoulders. "Are they settled?" Grace asked. "For now." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "Eleanor is inspecting the house, no doubt looking for evidence of my unfitness as a father. Harrington is reviewing his notes in the study." He sank into a chair across from Grace, reaching out to take Oliver's small hand in his. The baby grasped his finger tightly, a gesture of trust and connection that brought a fleeting smile to Ethan's face. "What are we going to do?" Grace asked quietly. Ethan's use of we rather than I didn't escape her notice. "Fight," he said simply. "I've spoken with Judge Parker already. He's skeptical of Eleanor's claims but concerned about her family's influence. The hearing will be fair, at least." "And if we lose?" Ethan's eyes met hers, fierce with determination. "We won't. I can't lose him, Grace. I won't." The conviction in his voice strengthened her resolve. The truth about Oliver's parentage would remain her secret, at least for now. She would not undermine Ethan's fight with a revelation that might weaken his position, legally or emotionally. "Then we prepare," she said. "We show Eleanor and the court that Oliver belongs here with you, with us." Ethan reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "With us," he repeated softly. And in that moment, Grace felt the weight of his trust, in her, in their unlikely partnership. In the future, they might build together if given the chance. The moment was interrupted by a sharp intake of breath from the doorway. Eleanor stood there, her expression a mixture of triumph and distaste, having witnessed their clasped hands in intimate conversation. "Well," she said coolly, "how very domestic. I see I was right about the nature of your arrangement here." Ethan withdrew his hand slowly, deliberately, refusing to act guilty or caught. "Eleanor," he acknowledged, his voice level. "Did you need something?" "Just confirming dinner arrangements with Miss Sullivan," she replied smoothly. "But I see you're both occupied." "Dinner will be served at 6, as mentioned," Grace said, rising with Oliver. "If you'll excuse me, I need to begin preparations." Eleanor didn't move from the doorway. "You know, Miss Sullivan, I've been wondering about you. A woman of your stature and age, working as a cook in remote Wyoming territory. It's an unusual choice." The implication was clear, that Grace had a past she was hiding, that her presence at Thornfield Ranch was suspicious. "I go where my skills are needed," Grace replied evenly. "Indeed," Eleanor murmured, "and your skills seem to extend beyond the kitchen into, shall we say, more personal domains?" Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough, Eleanor. You will not insult Miss Sullivan in her own home." "Her home?" Eleanor pounced on the slip. "How interesting that you consider it such, Ethan. The court will find that most illuminating." With that parting shot, she swept away, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. "I'm sorry," Ethan said after a moment. "She's trying to provoke us, to gather ammunition for the hearing." "I know." Grace bounced Oliver gently, soothing his fussiness. "But she's right about one thing. My presence here complicates matters. Perhaps I should—" "Don't," Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp with sudden fear. "Don't say you should leave. I couldn't bear it, Grace, not now. Not with everything at stake." The raw honesty in his plea stopped her. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the grief-stricken widower or the struggling father, but a man fighting his way back to himself, to a life worth living. A man who needed her, not just for Oliver's sake, but for his own. "I won't leave," she promised softly. "Not unless you ask me to." Relief washed over his features. "Thank you." He stepped closer, one hand coming up to touch her cheek in a gesture so gentle it made her breath catch. "We'll face this together, Grace. Whatever comes." Oliver chose that moment to let out a demanding squeal, breaking the tension and making them both laugh despite the gravity of their situation. "Yes, young sir, we haven't forgotten you," Ethan said, tickling the baby's stomach. "Never fear." As Grace turned to begin dinner preparations, she silently renewed her determination. Eleanor Blackwood, with all her Boston connections and legal maneuvers, would not destroy this fragile family they had created. Grace would make sure of it, whatever it took, whatever secret she had to reveal or keep, whatever sacrifice was required. Oliver belonged with Ethan, and Grace, against all odds and propriety, was beginning to believe she belonged with them both. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having passed in the night, leaving behind a crystalline landscape of untouched snow and ice-laden branches. Grace rose early, as always, to stoke the fire and prepare breakfast before Oliver woke. To her surprise, Eleanor was already in the kitchen, fully dressed despite the early hour, a cup of tea steaming before her at the table. "Miss Blackwood," Grace acknowledged cautiously, "you're up early." "I've always been an early riser," Eleanor replied, unlike Victoria, who preferred to sleep until noon. One of many differences between us. There was an odd note in her voice, something almost vulnerable beneath the crisp exterior. Grace, sensing an opportunity, set aside her wariness and approached the conversation with genuine curiosity. "You and your sister weren't alike then." Eleanor's laugh was short, almost bitter. "Not in the slightest. Victoria was beautiful, charming, the favorite, and I was the practical one, the reliable one. The one who stayed in Boston while Victoria followed up her romantic notions west with a man she barely knew." She sipped her tea, her gaze distant. "Do you have siblings, Miss Sullivan?" "A brother," Grace admitted. "Much older. We're estranged." "Family is complicated," Eleanor observed, "even when you love them, perhaps especially then. I loved Victoria dearly, but I didn't always understand her choices." "Like marrying Ethan," Grace ventured, measuring coffee grounds into the percolator. "Like marrying anyone, Summer," Eleanor corrected. "Victoria was not suited to matrimony. She was too restless, too hungry for admiration and excitement. Our parents pushed the match with Ethan because his family had name, if not fortune. Her letters after they moved here were concerning, lonely, increasingly desperate." Grace's hand stilled on the coffee pot. This was dangerous territory, edging too close to the secret she kept about Victoria and James Reed. "The frontier isn't for everyone," she said carefully. "It requires a certain resilience." "Which Victoria lacked," Eleanor agreed. "But you seem to possess it in abundance, Miss Sullivan. I wonder why that is." The question was pointed, probing. Grace chose her words with care. "Life teaches different lessons to different people, Miss Blackwood. I learned early that resilience was necessary for survival." Eleanor studied her with those sharp eyes. "Yes, I imagine you did. You're a woman with secrets, Miss Sullivan. I can sense it." Grace met her gaze steadily. "We all have our private sorrows, Miss Blackwood. Even you, I suspect." A flicker of surprise crossed Eleanor's face, quickly masked. "Quite the philosopher for a cook." She set down her teacup with precision. "I've been watching you with Oliver. He's attached to you." "Children form bonds easily with those who care for them," Grace replied, turning to light the stove. "Yes, but this seems particular. There's something almost maternal in your interaction with him." Grace froze, her back to Eleanor, heart suddenly pounding. Was this an accusation? A trap? She turned slowly, keeping her expression neutral. "I care for him deeply. That's not unusual for someone in my position." Eleanor tilted her head, considering. "No, I suppose not. But combined with your obvious regard for Ethan, it creates a concerning picture. The court might view it as inappropriate, even detrimental to Oliver's proper upbringing." And there it was, the threat beneath the seemingly civil conversation. Eleanor was warning her that her presence, her relationship with both Oliver and Ethan, would be used against them at the hearing. "I understand your concern for your nephew," Grace said carefully. But I believe what Oliver needs most is stability and love, which he has here with his father. And with you, Eleanor challenged, what exactly do you envision your role being in Oliver's future, Miss Sullivan? Surely not just a cook. The question struck at the heart of Grace's unspoken hopes, the dreams she barely allowed herself to acknowledge, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. My role is whatever best serves Oliver's needs, she answered finally. Nothing more, nothing less. Eleanor nodded slowly as if confirming a private suspicion. I see. Well, Miss Sullivan, I admire your dedication, misplaced though it may be. She rose gracefully. I'll wake Mr. Harrington. We should depart after breakfast, now that the roads are clear. As Eleanor left the kitchen, Grace released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The conversation had been a skirmish, a testing of defenses before the real battle at the hearing. And Eleanor had gained valuable intelligence. Confirmation of Grace's feelings for Ethan, her attachment to Oliver, her determination to keep them together. The question was, how would Eleanor use this information, and what would Grace do to counter it? The answer came to her suddenly, with startling clarity. She had been approaching this all wrong, trying to hide the truth, to protect everyone from pain. But perhaps the truth, or some version of it, was exactly what they needed now. Not the truth about Oliver's parentage. That secret would remain buried unless absolutely necessary. But the truth about herself, about her past, about the child she had lost and the life she had been trying to rebuild. The truth that might help Eleanor understand why Grace was so determined to keep Oliver with Ethan, whatever the cost. It was a risk, a significant one. But as Grace had reminded Ethan that night after the calving, sometimes the attempt itself was the victory, regardless of the outcome. With renewed determination, Grace finished preparing breakfast, her mind racing with plans for the conversation she needed to have with Eleanor before she departed. A conversation that might change everything, for better or worse. The breakfast dishes had been cleared, and Eleanor Blackwood stood in the guest room, methodically packing her small valise. Her movements were precise, practiced, the motions of a woman accustomed to ordering her world into neat compartments. Outside, Mr. Harrington was already loading his briefcase into the carriage, eager to return to more civilized accommodations in town before the hearing. Grace Sullivan paused at the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs. In her hand, she clutched a small handkerchief, worn thin from years of handling, and a folded letter yellowed with age. She had rehearsed what she would say a dozen times since dawn, yet the words still felt inadequate, dangerous. A soft knock on the open door frame made Eleanor turn, her eyebrows rising slightly at the sight of Grace. Miss Sullivan, did you need something? Grace stepped into the room, closing the door quietly behind her. A moment of your time, Miss Blackwood, before you leave. Eleanor glanced pointedly at the small clock on the bedside table. We have a schedule to keep. This won't take long, Grace promised, moving closer. But it's important, for Oliver's sake. At the mention of her nephew, Eleanor's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Very well, though I doubt there's anything you could say that would change the course of events. Grace extended her hand, offering the handkerchief and letter. I think you should see these. Eleanor hesitated, then accepted the items with obvious reluctance. She unfolded the handkerchief first, revealing the name Clara, embroidered in faded blue thread. Her questioning gaze returned to Grace. My daughter, Grace explained, her voice steady despite the old pain flaring in her chest. She died when she was 6 months old, almost Oliver's age now. Something flickered across Eleanor's perfect features, surprise perhaps, or the beginnings of unwanted sympathy. She unfolded the letter next, scanning its brief contents with narrowing eyes. A death certificate, she observed, for Clara Sullivan, born April 10, 1887, died October 23, 1887. Grace recited the dates from memory, each one etched into her heart. Cause of death, congenital heart failure. Eleanor refolded the letter carefully. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Sullivan, but I fail to see how this relates to the matter at hand. She was my daughter, Miss Blackwood, born out of wedlock to a banker's son who promised marriage, then disappeared at the first whisper of scandal. Grace moved to the window, gathering strength from the vast Wyoming landscape stretching beyond the glass. My family disowned me. The father's family denied any connection. No doctor would attend a fallen woman's illegitimate child when she fell ill. A tragic story, Eleanor said, her tone softening despite herself. But I'm telling you this, Grace interrupted gently, turning back to face her, because I want you to understand why I care so deeply about what happens to Oliver. Because he reminds you of your lost child, Eleanor concluded as if solving a simple equation. Grace shook her head. Because I understand, better than most, the true value of family. Not the kind bound by social conventions or legal documents, but the kind forged through love and sacrifice. She took a deep breath. I've seen how Ethan fights his demons every day to be a better father for Oliver. I've watched him learn to hold his son, to comfort him, to put his needs before his own pain. Noble sentiments, Eleanor said, but her customary sharpness had dulled. However, sentiment doesn't change facts. Oliver deserves the advantages only Boston can provide. What Oliver deserves, Grace countered, is to be loved for himself, not as a replacement or a representative of his mother. Eleanor stiffened. I loved my sister. I love her son. I believe you do, Grace said softly. But is your love for Oliver strong enough to put his happiness above your own desires? Above what you think Victoria would have wanted? Eleanor turned away, but not before Grace caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in her expression. When she spoke again, her voice held a note Grace hadn't heard before, something raw and honest beneath the polished exterior. You don't understand, Miss Sullivan. Victoria and we made a pact when we were girls. She was the beautiful one, the charming one, the one everyone adored. I was, she gestured vaguely at herself, the practical one, the reliable one, the one who would likely never marry. Grace waited, sensing there was more. Victoria promised me that if she ever had children, they would be as much mine as hers. Eleanor's fingers absently traced the embroidered name on the handkerchief. She knew I couldn't, that I would never have children of my own. Oliver was to be part of my life too. A nephew in name, but almost a son in heart. The confession hung in the air between them, altering the shape of their conflict. No longer simply a battle between Boston propriety and frontier pragmatism, but between two women who had each lost something precious and were trying, in their different ways, to heal that loss. I didn't know, Grace said softly. Why would you? Eleanor set down the handkerchief with careful precision. But now you understand, I'm not trying to steal Oliver out of malice or mere propriety. I'm trying to fulfill a promise, to give him the life Victoria would have wanted for him. And what of the life Ethan wants for his son? Eleanor's laugh held no humor. Ethan married Victoria as a social arrangement. He retreated into himself long before her death. He may care for Oliver in his way, but he loves him, Grace interrupted firmly, with everything he has, and Oliver loves him back. Love isn't always enough, Miss Sullivan. It's a better foundation than duty or obligation, Grace countered. She took a risk then, reaching out to touch Eleanor's arm lightly. What if there's a way for everyone to have a place in Oliver's life, for him to know both his father's home and his mother's family? Eleanor studied her for a long moment. You're proposing a compromise? I'm proposing that Oliver deserves to be surrounded by all the people who love him, his father, his aunt, the community here that has embraced him. Grace paused. Including me. Something shifted in Eleanor's expression, a recognition, perhaps, of the truth Grace wasn't quite saying aloud. You care for him as if he were your own. Yes, Grace admitted, though I have no right to. And Ethan, do you care for him as well? The directness of the question caught Grace off guard. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, but met Eleanor's gaze steadily. That's not relevant to Oliver's future, isn't it? Eleanor tilted her head slightly. If you were to become his stepmother? No one has proposed such an arrangement, Grace said carefully. But if they did? Grace took a deep breath. Then I would strive to be the best mother I could be to Oliver, while honoring Victoria's memory and respecting your place in his life. Eleanor turned back to her packing, her movements more deliberate than before. For several moments she said nothing, and Grace began to fear she had overstepped. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her back still turned. I still intend to proceed with the hearing, Miss Sullivan, but I will. Consider what you've said. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. Grace recognized it as the most she could hope for at this moment. Thank you for listening, Miss Blackwood. As she turned to leave, Eleanor's voice stopped her at the door. Miss Sullivan, your daughter, Clara. She had a good mother, however briefly. The words seemed to cost Eleanor something to say, as if admitting Grace's worthiness went against everything she had decided about her. Grace's throat tightened. Thank you, she whispered, and slipped from the room before her composure could crack. The Silver Creek Courthouse was the grandest building in town, which wasn't saying much. Its wooden columns and modest dome attempted dignity despite the peeling paint and uneven porch steps. Today, however, it hummed with activity as townsfolk gathered for what promised to be the most interesting legal proceeding since old Jeb Watson's dispute over water rights 3 years prior. Inside, the small courtroom was already crowded when Grace arrived with Ethan and Oliver. The baby, dressed in his finest clothes, gazed around with bright curiosity at the unfamiliar surroundings. Ethan, in a freshly pressed suit that hung a bit loose on his frame, looked pale but determined. Martha Wilson and Ida Jenkins had secured seats in the front row, and Robert Crawford stood near the back, his Sunday hat clutched respectfully in his hands. Even Dr. Lawrence was present, sitting apart from the others, his expression unreadable. Quite the turnout, Ethan murmured, shifting Oliver to his other arm. Half the town must be here. They're here for you, Grace assured him, for both of you. Before Ethan could respond, the side door opened and Eleanor entered with Mr. Harrington. She wore a tailored traveling suit in deep blue, her hair arranged perfectly beneath a modest hat. Her eyes met Grace's briefly, revealing nothing of their earlier conversation. All rise, called the bailiff as Judge Parker entered, a stout man with a bristling white mustache and eyes sharp enough to pin a man to the wall. Everyone scrambled to their feet as he took his seat at the bench. Be seated, he instructed, surveying the crowded room with a mixture of amusement and resignation. I see half of Silver Creek has decided today's entertainment is to be found in my courtroom rather than the saloon. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the spectators. Your Honor, Mr. Harrington began, rising smoothly to his feet. We are here today regarding the guardianship of minor child Oliver Thornfield, currently in the custody of his father, Ethan Thornfield. So I've read in your petition, Judge Parker nodded. Proceed with your argument, Counselor. What followed was an hour of carefully constructed legal arguments and emotional appeals. Harrington presented letters from Victoria describing Ethan's withdrawal after the war, his refusal to practice medicine, his bouts of melancholy. He called witnesses from Boston who had visited the Thornfields and found the household unconventional and concerning. He emphasized Eleanor's position in society, the educational opportunities available in Boston, the advantages of being raised among one's own kind. Through it all, Ethan sat rigidly beside Grace, his jaw tightening with each new accusation, but remaining silent as instructed by the local attorney who had agreed to represent him. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he rose slowly, handing Oliver to Grace. The courtroom hushed as he approached the bench, his posture straight despite the weight of scrutiny pressing down on him. Your Honor, he began, his voice steadier than Grace had expected. I won't deny the difficulties I've faced since returning from the war. The things I saw there, the men I couldn't save. He paused, collecting himself. Those experiences changed me. When Victoria died, I nearly lost myself completely. He turned slightly, his gaze finding Oliver in Grace's arms. But my son saved me. Every day he gives me a reason to be better, to try harder, to find my way back to the man I once was. Judge Parker leaned forward. Mr. Thornfield, your medical condition has been called into question. Your ability to practice your profession. I've begun consulting with Dr. Lawrence, Ethan interrupted, gesturing to where the other doctor sat. Not practicing yet, but studying again, learning new techniques. And I've established a small clinic for the ranch hands and their families. A murmur rippled through the courtroom at this revelation. Grace herself felt a surge of surprise and pride. Ethan hadn't told her about the clinic. And the child's day-to-day care, the judge pressed. Miss Blackwood suggests it falls primarily to hired help. Miss Sullivan has been invaluable, Ethan acknowledged. But I feed Oliver, bathe him, read to him every night. I'm learning to be the father he deserves. He straightened his shoulders. I may not offer the social advantages of Boston, Your Honor, but I offer love, stability, and a father who will move mountains to ensure his happiness. When Grace was called to testify, she spoke plainly of Oliver's development, of Ethan's growing confidence as a father, of the supportive community surrounding them. She felt Eleanor's gaze on her throughout, but didn't falter. Martha Wilson testified about Ethan's regular visits to town with Oliver, about his inquiries regarding childhood ailments and developmental milestones. Dr. Lawrence, to everyone's surprise, spoke eloquently about the nature of war trauma and Ethan's commendable efforts to recover. Dr. Lawrence approached the witness stand, his posture reflecting years of professional dignity. As he took the oath, his eyes met Ethan's briefly, a look that contained years of unspoken history. Lawrence, Judge Parker began, your professional assessment of Mr. Thornfield's condition? Ethan was one of my most promising students at Philadelphia Medical College before the war, Lawrence stated firmly. I offered him a partnership in my Boston practice afterward, which he declined. Due to his condition, the judge inquired. Due to his integrity, Lawrence corrected. He refused to practice when he felt his trauma might compromise patient care. That speaks to his character, not weakness. He turned to face the judge directly. In my 30 years of practice, I've learned that healing isn't linear. Ethan stumbled, but never stopped trying. That perseverance is exactly what a child needs in a father. As the afternoon wore on, Grace dared to hope. The tide seemed to be turning in their favor, Judge Parker's expressions growing more thoughtful and less skeptical with each testimony. Then, just as Harrington rose for his closing statement, the courtroom door opened with a decisive click. All heads turned to see a stranger enter, a man in his early 30s, well-dressed but travel-worn, with dark hair and a solemn expression. He removed his hat as he approached the front of the courtroom. Forgive the interruption, he said, addressing the judge. My name is James Reed. I've come from Denver regarding the matter of Oliver Thornfield. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Grace felt the blood drain from her face as she recognized the name from Victoria's letters. Beside her, Ethan had gone rigid, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the table. Eleanor half rose from her seat, her composure cracking. What is the meaning of this? Judge Parker banged his gavel. Order. Sir, this is a closed hearing. Unless you have relevant testimony. I believe I do, Your Honor. Reed's voice was steady, educated. I was a friend of Victoria Thornfield. The emphasis on friend sent another ripple through the spectators. Judge Parker's bushy eyebrows rose, but he nodded. Very well. Approach and state your piece. Reed moved to the front of the courtroom with quiet dignity. I knew Victoria for several years. We corresponded regularly after her move to Wyoming Territory. He glanced briefly at Eleanor, then at Ethan. Victoria was not always happy in her marriage. She had considered other arrangements for her future. Eleanor's face had gone white. This is improper, Your Honor. This man has no standing. Let him speak, Judge Parker instructed firmly. Reed reached into his coat and withdrew a letter. This was the last correspondence I received from Victoria, written just days before she gave birth to Oliver. He handed it to the judge, who adjusted his spectacles and read it silently, his expression growing increasingly grave. The courtroom held its collective breath. In this letter, Reed continued, addressing the room rather than just the judge, Victoria expressed her intentions regarding her child. She wrote, and I quote, "Whatever path I choose for myself, my child belongs with Ethan. He will be a better parent than I could ever hope to be. I need you to understand and accept this, James." He turned to face Eleanor directly. She knew your wishes, Miss Blackwood, but she was explicit in her desire for her child to be raised by his father. Eleanor had sunk back into her seat, her face ashen. Mr. Harrington was frantically whispering in her ear, but she seemed beyond hearing. Judge Parker handed the letter to his clerk, then removed his spectacles wearily. This brings a new dimension to the proceedings. He looked at Reed. Do you have any personal claim or interest in the child, Mr. Reed? Reed shook his head. None, Your Honor. I came only to ensure Victoria's wishes were known. His gaze moved briefly to Oliver, a flash of something unreadable crossing his features, before he stepped back. With your permission, I'll take my leave now. As suddenly as he had appeared, James Reed departed, leaving a courtroom buzzing with whispers and speculation. Grace felt as if she were dreaming, the dramatic arrival and departure of this mysterious figure from Victoria's past, the revelation of her final wishes, the stunned silence from Eleanor's side of the room. Judge Parker banged his gavel sharply. In light of this new evidence, I'll take a brief recess to consider my ruling. Court will resume in 1 hour. Grace and Ethan stood in the small garden behind the courthouse, Oliver playing contentedly at their feet with a wooden horse Crawford had carved for him. Neither had spoken much since the judge's recess, both too overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. Finally, Grace broke the silence. Did you know he would come? Ethan shook his head, his gaze fixed on some distant point. No, though part of me has been waiting for him to appear since Victoria died. He glanced down at Oliver, a complex emotion crossing his face. I suppose I should thank him for supporting my claim. Grace hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind since James Reed's appearance. Ethan, did you know about Victoria and Reed? He was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low, meant only for her ears. Yes, Victoria told me before Oliver was born. She was planning to leave when she was strong enough to travel after the birth. A sad smile touched his lips. Our marriage wasn't a love match, Grace. We both knew that from the beginning. I respected her, admired her in many ways, but we were never truly happy together. And Oliver? Grace whispered, hardly daring to breathe the question. Ethan knelt beside his son, gently brushing a lock of hair from the boy's forehead. Biologically, he's almost certainly Reed's child, but in every way that matters, he's mine. He looked up at Grace, his blue eyes fierce with conviction. Blood doesn't make a father. Love does. Commitment does. Daily choices do. Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the simple truth of his words. Why didn't you tell me you knew? At first, because I barely knew you. Ethan rose, brushing dirt from his knees. Later, because I feared you might see me differently. As a fool, perhaps, for raising another man's child. He paused. And then, because I found the letters in Victoria's sewing box and realized you must have discovered them too. You never mentioned them, which told me everything I needed to know about your character. A small sound made them both turn. Eleanor stood a few feet away, her face composed once more, but marked by a new gravity. She approached slowly, her gaze moving from Ethan to Grace, then settling on Oliver. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the child. Ethan nodded, though tension remained in his shoulders. Eleanor knelt carefully, mindful of her fine skirt, and touched Oliver's cheek with gentle fingers. He has her smile, she said softly. I see it when he laughs. Yes, Ethan agreed. He does. Eleanor looked up, meeting Ethan's gaze directly. Did you know about Reed when you married her? No, not until near the end. And you stayed, claimed the child as yours. He is mine, Ethan said simply. Eleanor nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in her eyes. She rose and straightened her skirt. Once again the Boston lady, though somehow changed. Mr. Harrington is preparing to withdraw our petition, she announced. In light of Victoria's expressed wishes, continuing would be inappropriate. Grace released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you, Miss Blackwood. Don't thank me yet, Miss Sullivan. Eleanor's tone remained cool but lacked its former bite. I still believe Oliver should know his mother's family, his heritage. I still believe he deserves certain advantages that Silver Creek cannot provide. What are you proposing? Ethan asked cautiously. A compromise, Eleanor replied, echoing Grace's earlier words. I withdraw my petition for guardianship, acknowledging your role as Oliver's father. In return, I ask for regular visitation rights, perhaps twice yearly to start, and when Oliver is older, the opportunity for him to visit Boston during summers, to know the other half of his family. It was more than they could have hoped for, and far less than they had feared. Ethan extended his hand. Those terms are acceptable. Eleanor clasped his hand briefly, then surprised Grace by turning to her as well. Miss Sullivan, Miss Blackwood, I trust you will continue to provide Oliver with the maternal care he requires. A wealth of meaning lay beneath the carefully chosen words. Acknowledgement, permission, perhaps even a grudging blessing. With all my heart, Grace promised. Eleanor nodded once decisively, then bent to place a light kiss on Oliver's head before turning away. At the garden gate, she paused, looking back at the three of them. Ethan, Grace, and Oliver, already forming the shape of a family. "Take care of them, Miss Sullivan," she said quietly. "They need you more than they know." With that, she was gone, her blue dress disappearing around the corner of the courthouse, leaving Grace with the distinct impression that she had just received approval from the most unexpected source possible. The journey home from Silver Creek was made in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the wagon rolled through the golden afternoon light. Oliver had fallen asleep, lulled by the steady motion and the excitement of the day. About a mile from the ranch, Ethan unexpectedly pulled the wagon to a stop atop a small rise overlooking the valley. The Thornfield property stretched below them, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. The house, the barn, the corral, the fields extending to the distant tree line. "Why are we stopping?" Grace asked, adjusting Oliver's blanket against the cooling air. Ethan set the brake and turned to her, his expression both nervous and determined. "Because there's something I need to say, and I don't want to wait another moment to say it." Grace's heart quickened. "Ethan." "When Eleanor threatened to take Oliver," he continued, his voice low and urgent, "I was terrified. Not just of losing my son, but of losing you too. Of having our family torn apart before it had really begun." "Our family," Grace echoed softly. "Yes." Ethan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the fading sunlight. A ring, a simple gold band without ornamentation, but burnished to a warm glow. "I've had this since Christmas. I've been carrying it, waiting for the right moment, afraid you might say no." Grace stared at the ring, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "I'm not the man I was before the war," Ethan said, echoing words she had spoken to him months ago. "I may never be that man again, but I'm becoming someone new, someone better because of you and Oliver." He took her hand gently. "I love you, Grace Sullivan, not despite your past or your pain, but because they made you who you are, the strongest, kindest, most honest woman I've ever known." "Ethan," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "Will you marry me, Grace? Will you be Oliver's mother in name as well as in heart? Will you help me build a life worth living, a home worth having?" The question hung between them, simple and profound. Grace looked at the sleeping child, at the man before her with hope and fear mingled in his blue eyes, at the land spread below them that had somehow become home. She thought of all she had lost, all she had found, the long journey that had led her to this moment. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Yes to all of it, Ethan." His smile broke like sunshine through clouds as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all along for this moment, this hand, this promise. Oliver stirred between them, blinking sleepily at their faces so close together. "Look who's awake," Ethan said, brushing a kiss against the baby's forehead. "Just in time to hear the good news. Miss Grace is going to stay with us forever." "Mama," Oliver murmured, reaching for Grace with complete trust and affection. It was the first time he had said the word. Grace gathered him close, her heart so full it seemed impossible her body could contain it. "Yes, little one," she whispered against his hair. "Your mama is here." Spring came early to Wyoming the following year, painting the prairie with wildflowers and tender green shoots. The Thornfield Ranch had weathered the winter well, emerging from the snow with renewed purpose and energy. On the wide porch of the ranch house, Grace sat in a rocking chair, her hands resting on her rounded belly where a new life grew. Oliver, nearly 18 months old now, played at her feet with a collection of wooden animals Crawford had crafted for him. His dark curls caught the sunlight, and his laughter rose like music on the clean spring air. From the direction of the small clinic that had been built near the edge of the property, Ethan appeared, his medical bag in hand, his step lighter than it had been in years. Lawrence visited monthly from town now, mentoring Ethan as he gradually returned to medical practice, focusing primarily on the needs of the ranch hands and their families. "How's Mrs. Jensen?" Grace called as Ethan approached. "Doing well. The twins are strong, though they gave her quite a fright coming early." He climbed the steps and bent to kiss her, then ruffled Oliver's hair. "And how are my favorite patients today?" "Active," Grace laughed, placing his hand on her belly to feel the strong kicks within. This one's going to be a dancer, I think. Or a horse trainer, Ethan suggested, smiling as he felt the movement beneath his palm. The sound of carriage wheels drew their attention. A smart black buggy was approaching, driven by a livered coachman. Eleanor Blackwood had arrived for her spring visit, right on schedule. "Auntie," Oliver cried, scrambling to his feet with excitement. Despite the initial wariness on both sides, Eleanor had proven to be a devoted aunt, sending packages of books and toys from Boston and writing letters that Grace read aloud to Oliver each night. As the carriage drew to a stop, Grace watched Ethan lift Oliver into his arms and walk down to greet their visitor. The scene before her, the man she loved, the child they shared, the extended family they were building, seemed like a dream after so many years of loneliness and loss. Yet it was real. As real as the ring on her finger, the child in her womb, the home they had created together. Not all love begins with a first glance. Sometimes it begins with a hard truth spoken aloud. Sometimes it grows slowly through shared care and daily kindnesses. And sometimes, when you least expect it, it blooms into something more beautiful than you ever dared to hope for. Grace rose from her chair and went to join her family, her heart full of gratitude for the journey that had led her here, to Thornfield Ranch, to Ethan and Oliver, to the life she had found when she was no longer running from the past but walking steadily toward the future. A future that, like the Wyoming spring unfurling around them, held the promise of new beginnings, unexpected joys, and love enough to heal even the deepest wounds.